Hey, do you think that in the Pokémon world, Galarian pop culture took over the rest of the world in the 1960s? Was there a famous band called the Orbeetles? Was the Winden look a popular fashion trend? Was the miniskirt invented in Galar? Were there Galarian models who modeled it like Twiggy and Jean Shrimpton did in our world? Were there mods and rockers? Was there psychedelic art? Was psychedelic art in the Pokémon world inspired by psychic-type moves instead of drugs? As you may or may not know, I love Pokémon. It's been my favorite media franchise for years. I've been playing the game since Heart Gold and Soul Silver, I've written Pokémon fanfics, I've drawn Pokémon fan art, I've made Pokémon cosplays, I own tons of Pokémon merchandise, and I know so many useless bits of Pokémon lore that I've described myself many times as a human Pokédex. And with Pokémon Legends ZA on the horizon, I figured there was no better time than now to make a new Pokémon video, and to go all out. Now, you've probably figured out by now that I love wearing vintage-style outfits, but I also have a fascination with fashion history in general. It's just so cool to me to look at how clothing has evolved and changed, admire how beautiful and elegant the outfits of the past looked, and, in some cases, try to recreate styles from the past here in the present. So, naturally, I thought it would be fun to tell you about all the Pokémon that are, or might be, inspired by fashion history. I'd be using 2 of my boundless fonts of knowledge in order to teach people something, or perhaps spread new ideas around the Pokémon fandom. And yes, I'm wearing a 1960s style mini dress with a beehive hairdo and Twiggy-inspired makeup, but the dress is decorated with little Jigglypuffs and Spheals. Pretty groovy, right? Anyways, let's establish some ground rules. First, these will be in national Pokédex order. Second, regional forms will be counted alongside their default forms, but evolutions to their regional forms will be discussed separately. Third, fashion is not just clothing, it also extends to things like hair and makeup, so a Pokémon does not necessarily need to look like it's wearing clothes to be inspired by historical or vintage fashion. Fourth, for my purposes, traditional cultural garments, such as, for example, the Lotad-lined sombreros, Frostlass's kimono, or anything the Oricorio forms are wearing, do not count as historical fashion. They're still worn by modern people, if only on special occasions. They're basically their own thing. Fifth, historical armor and military uniforms do count as historical fashion, though. Ditto for vintage sports uniforms. Note that I said vintage, not modern, so I can throw her off the table. If it was widely worn in the past but isn't worn anymore except by historical reenactors or as a costume, it counts. Sixth, inspired by vintage fashion can be defined 2 ways. Either Pokémon whose style is reminiscent of a time period from before the games were released, or Pokémon who were based on then contemporary fashion trends that look vintage in hindsight. So, without further ado, let's get this Pokéball rolling! The Pokémon of the first couple generations are kinda generic design-wise, so with Gens 1 and 2, I won't have as much to talk about compared to later generations. But there are still a few gems with vintage fashion inspirations. While normal Dugtrio is not very stylish, Alolan Dugtrio now sports 3 luscious heads of blonde hair. And funnily enough, all of these hairstyles look kind of mid-1970s to me. One has loose waves, one has a page boy cut, and one has a middle part with long hair down its back. The 70s was a time when long hair was popular on both sexes, and considering these Pokémon are based on Pele's hair, a type of volcanic glass that looks like human hair, I can definitely see why they turned to the 70s for inspiration. Look at the massive shoulders on the Abra line! Now, I don't know about you, but I'm reminded of the big shoulder pads that were popular in both menswear and womenswear in the 1980s. And considering the Abra line is inspired by stage magicians, I'm reminded of Siegfried and Roy, those Las Vegas magicians with the trained lions that were very popular in the 80s and 90s. Throughout their career, they were always wearing shoulder-padded suits, and sometimes even wore full-on chest armor. In fact, stage magic experienced a huge boom in popularity during the 80s. Remember when David Copperfield made the Statue of Liberty disappear? Yeah, that was in 1983. So it makes sense that these Pokémon, who are based heavily on illusionists and magicians, take a bit of inspiration from 80s fashion. Hitmonchan is supposed to be a professional boxer, but his clothing is not at all what modern boxers actually wear. Pro boxers are supposed to wear loose-fitting shorts and perhaps a shirt in certain contexts, while what Hitmonchan is wearing is more akin to a belted tunic. To me, this resembles an exomus, a type of tunic worn by soldiers and working-class men in ancient Greece. Perhaps this is a nod to ancient Greek boxing, which, while not the first ever incarnation of the sport, was the first to use gloves and forbid its participants from kicking and grabbing. And yes, I'm aware that most ancient Greek boxers competed completely nude except for their gloves, but I did find a painting from about 100 BC that indicates that, at least in some jurisdictions, clothing was allowed. Galarian Wheezing has two steam-spewing pipes on its head that look like very tall top hats. During the Victorian and Edwwardian eras, the top hat was a staple of every well-to-do gentleman's wardrobe, and was often worn to formal events or just when out on the town. Galarian Wheezing's top hats most closely resemble the stovepipe hat, a style of top hat popular from the 1840s to the 1860s, which was extremely tall and narrow. Here in the United States, we tend to associate the stovepipe hat with Abraham Lincoln, who often wore them during his presidency. However, considering Galar is based on Great Britain, I think it's more inspired by how common these kinds of hats were during the latter part of the Industrial Revolution, when steam power was a common source of energy. In fact, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, a famous English engineer and inventor from the early Victorian era, may have been a big inspiration. Brunel is often considered a quintessentially British historical figure, to the point where he's pretty obscure outside of his home country. He designed the Great Western Railway, built a ton of bridges that are still standing today, and revolutionized oceanic travel with his record-breaking steamships. One of his ships, the SS Great Britain, was the biggest ship ever built at the time and the first metal steamship to cross the Atlantic Ocean. And the most iconic picture of Brunel depicts him standing on one of his ships, with his hands in his pockets, wearing a stovepipe hat. The shape of Mr. Mime's feet seems to be inspired by poulaines, a type of shoe with long toes that often curled inward. These shoes were very popular in the late Middle Ages, especially in the 15th century. The combination of the poulaines and the shape of its hair may have been intended to evoke the classic court jester, though the hair may be a bit of a stretch as it's also a very stereotypical clown hairdo. Krusty the Clown from The Simpsons has a similar hairstyle. Galarian Mr. Mime, however, swaps out the medieval-looking shoes for more modern men's dress shoes, and wears a white necktie. Considering it's a tap dancer, this may be reminiscent of men's fashions in the late 1930s and early 1940s, when tap dancers like Bill Bojangles Robinson and the Nicholas brothers were very popular. While Jinx's origins are complicated, she is primarily based on the Yamauba, a creature from Japanese mythology who lives in the mountains and has the ability to cover them in snow. She is said to resemble a human woman, usually middle-aged or older, with dark, frostbitten skin, platinum blonde hair, and a tattered red dress. However, she may also take inspiration from Japanese street fashion of the 90s. At first, I thought she had to be based on the Ganguro and Yamanba styles of fashion, which were very popular in the 90s and early 2000s. This style is a rebellion against the Japanese beauty standards of pale skin, black hair, and natural makeup, with Ganguro and Yamanba girls tanning very heavily, bleaching their hair, and wearing extremely conspicuous makeup, usually involving light-colored eyeshadow and lipstick to make their facial features pop against their tan skin. The name Yamanba even comes from the Yamauba, because the style resembles most depictions of her. There's just one problem, though. Ganguro only became popular in the mid-90s, and concept art of Jinx has been found that dates back to 1993, which still depicts her with blonde hair and dark skin. But Ganguro evolved from gyaru, a fashion trend that originated in the 80s and was popular throughout the 90s, where tanning, blonde hair, and light-colored makeup were common trends. So she might take inspiration from gyaru fashion. This explains why Jinx has wide eyes, pale pink lips, straight hair that reflects 1990s women's hairstyle trends, and why her Japanese name is Rougera, after rouge, another word for blush. Remember how I said Gens 1 and 2 didn't have much? Well, looking through Generation 2, I could only find 2 Pokémon with vintage fashion inspirations. And funnily enough, they're both evolutions of Gen 1 Pokémon. Slowking is supposed to be a kingly Pokémon, and fittingly it seems to be wearing a ruff, which was popularly worn by nobility and royalty during the 16th and 17th centuries. Almost every king and queen during this span of time wore some kind of ruff. Here's a picture of King James of England and Scotland, the guy who the King James version of the Bible was named after, wearing a big crown and a ruff, just like Slowking. Speaking of England and Scotland, let's also look at its Galarian form, which switches out its ruff for a cloak. This cloak reads to me as far more medieval, and bears particular resemblance to the chaperon, a hooded short cloak from the 13th century. Considering it's supposed to be a wizard or warlock, a more medieval style is fitting, because a lot of high fantasy stories are set during that time. Now, I don't know if it's only me that sees this, but Blissy's design reads to me as very 1950s housewife. Her hair is shorter than Chansey's and is in big, voluminous curls on the sides of her head. The popular women's hairstyles of the 50s were usually short, with big curls that were most pronounced near the jawline. She also has these frills around her hip that create the illusion of a flared dress, popular during this time. And the frills on her sleeves could either be short sleeves on a dress or the ruffles on the edge of many vintage aprons. It's even bright bubblegum pink, which was an extremely trendy color in the 50s. Considering it's a motherly Pokémon, it makes sense that it has some 1950s housewife elements, as most of the modern stereotypes and archetypes associated with mothers either originated or were most strongly enforced in the 50s. Generation 3 is when Pokémon designs began to have multiple facets to them. We didn't see as much, oh, it's just this animal from the real world, or, oh, it's just this animal from the real world but with elemental powers. We started seeing them add more elements to their design to distinguish them from their real-world inspirations. So, because of this, we saw an increase in Pokémon that were inspired by historical fashion. Normal Zigzagoon and Lanoon don't really have any vintage fashion inspirations, but their Galarian forms most certainly do. They're inspired by Kiss, an iconic rock band from the 1970s. Kiss was known for their extravagant costumes, which involved lots of spandex, metallic details, platform boots, big bushy hairstyles, and their trademark white face paint with black designs on them. Each member had a superhero-like nickname and a unique design on his face that matched it. Zigzagoon and Lanoon's Galarian forms have many elements of this band's costumes, with their black and white color schemes, designs on their faces, the gray fur cuffs on Lanoon, and even Lanoon's claws changing from white to gray to look like they could be made of metal. Zigzagoon's face paint has elements from all four members of Kiss: Paul Stanley's star over the eye, Ace Frehley's symmetrical design joined by a bridge in the middle, Peter Criss's black nose, and Gene Simmons' tendency towards sticking his tongue out. Lanoon also has the stars over the eyes, but is leaning more heavily into Gene Simmons, with the exaggeratedly long tongue and the arrow on its face being reminiscent of Simmons' exaggerated widow's beak. Each member of the Ralts evolutionary line seems to combine medieval and modern stylings, which makes sense, as the evolutionary line is themed around both knights and European dance styles. Ralts is the first evolution, and it clearly has a bowl cut. This was a common hairstyle for men in medieval Europe, mainly because it was very easy for barbers to cut hair into this style. They just needed a large bowl to use as a guide, hence the name. This also made it popular for parents in the 20th century to give to their kids, especially their sons, in order to save money on trips to the hairdresser. Thus, in the late 20th century and into the 21st century, it began to be seen as a child's hairstyle and fell out of favor with adults. If you look through old elementary and middle school yearbooks, you'll see a lot of little boys with bowl cuts. Its legs looking like a billowy robe or dress is also appropriate, as many people wore robes in medieval times. Children especially would wear long dresses or robes until they were fully potty trained, a tradition that would continue until the early 20th century. Moving on to Kirlia, it appears to be wearing a stiff flared skirt and a pair of tights. Of course, this could just be a platter tutu and dancing tights because it's a ballet dancer and everything, but it's also very similar to clothes worn by younger men in the 14th and 15th centuries, during the late Middle Ages. At this time, young men would often wear short tunics that were cinched at the waist to create a sort of skirt, as well as hose, which were basically tights. Its hairstyle, though, is very much a modern girl's hairstyle, as it's clearly reminiscent of pigtails. Finally, we come to Gardevoir, whose hairstyle looks way more reminiscent of 20th century women's hairstyles than anything else, but also kind of looks like a medieval knight's helmet. However, her dress and the coloration on her torso and arms resemble women's gowns from, again, the 14th and 15th centuries. Close-fitting and long-sleeved at the top, but very billowy at the bottom. older and high-status men also wore long robes during the 15th century, which may be why Gardevoir's gender ratio is 50-50. Its mega evolution is more of a late 1940s or early to mid 1950s evening gown / wedding dress look. Considering Mega Gardevoir as the signature Pokemon of Diantha, who is based on Audrey Hepburn, an actress from the 50s and 60s, I kinda get why they went with a mid-century look for Mega Gardevoir instead of continuing with the medieval theme. Volbeat and Illumise are supposed to be two fireflies that are in love with each other. Fittingly, they seem to be based on 1950s teenagers who had a very active dating culture. They'd go on dates all the time with their classmates. I should know, my maternal grandparents were teens in the 50s and were high school sweethearts, and they're still together! Anyways, Volbeat is based on a greaser delinquent, you know, like Ponyboy or the Fonz. He looks like he's wearing a black jacket with a popped collar, and the pattern on his belly looks like a striped t-shirt, commonly worn by boys during the 50s. Illumise, however, has chin-length curled hair typical of 1950s women's fashion, and looks like she's wearing a black cardigan over a collared shirt, which was typical teenage attire in the 50s. Now, it's worth noting that greasers were typically rebellious troublemakers, known for smoking, skipping school, and driving cars way over the speed limit, and the ladies loved them for it. And Illumise and Volbeat do kinda have that good girl, bad boy thing going on, especially when you consider that Illumise's abilities are Oblivious and Tinted Lens. Like, she's oblivious to her boyfriend's flaws and views him through rose-tinted glasses. Real I can fix him energy. Now, this one might be a stretch again, but Lockstin pointed out that Armaldo's body shares many similarities with Tosei Gusoku samurai armor, especially the flaps on the back of its body resembling arrow guards. He also points out that Armaldo's head bears some similarity to helmets worn by the Saxons. These are both quite old and outdated styles of armor, fitting for a fossil Pokémon. Milotic is a Pokémon designed to be the picture of beauty. Fittingly, it looks like a lady with pretty hair. However, since this game was released in the 2000s, its hair is very straight and lays very flat on its head. Long, straight hair was the beauty standard in the late 90s and early 2000s, as seen on many of the celebrities of the time. However, there's also some Heian period inspiration here. For those who don't know, the Heian period was an era in Japanese history lasting from 794 to 1185, which was flourishing with art and culture. Women during this era also had long and straight hair that was often parted in the middle. Milotic's tail even resembles a hand fan, which were commonly used by upper-class people in Japan throughout its history. I'd also like to point out the Italian Renaissance, especially the painting The Birth of Venus. Here, Venus, the Roman goddess of love and beauty, is depicted with long red hair, rising from the sea inside a seashell. It was fashionable during the Italian Renaissance for women to wear their hair down or in a half-up, half-down hairstyle, and a lot of Renaissance art depicted women with long, flowing hair. It's very possible that Milotic's hairstyle was inspired by either the Heian period, the birth of Venus, contemporary trends for women's hairstyles, or all three. Snowrunt appears to be wearing an old Japanese garment called a mino, which was a cloak made from woven rice straw that protected the wearer against rain and snow. Fitting for an ice-type Pokémon that lives in snowy areas. Now, you might be thinking, how would a coat made of itchy straw have protected someone against precipitation? Well, because rice is a semi-aquatic plant that's traditionally planted in a couple inches of water, rice straw is naturally water resistant, and water rolls off it very easily. So in a time before rubber was widely available, it was one of the best materials to make a raincoat out of. The introduction of waterproof fabrics, however, rendered mino obsolete, and today you only ever see them as part of a costume. Gen 4, in my eyes, was the moment that Pokémon decided it was going to take itself seriously. It was going to prove to the world that it was more than just a passing fad. They made a deeper story with fate of the universe stakes, they wrote a villain who was motivated by a tragic backstory rather than just because I can, they stopped making out-of-place references to the real world and established that the Pokémon world is its own distinct thing, they gave this new distinct world a creation story and the most godlike legendaries we've ever seen, and they made some of the most masterfully designed Pokémon in franchise history. Speaking of which, let's talk about the Pokémon in this generation that resemble vintage and historical styles. The Piplup line is a literal take on the Emperor Penguin, with Empoleon in particular being based on Napoleon Bonaparte, the famous military general and emperor of France during the early 1800s. So naturally, their designs include nods to the fashions of the Napoleonic era, also known as the Regency era or the Bridgerton era. Piplup and Printplup have markings on their chests which look like buttons, making them appear to be wearing double-breasted coats. Double-breasted waistcoats were a staple of any gentleman's wardrobe in the Napoleonic era, and double-breasted overcoats were also common, including among Napoleon and his army. Printplup's tail even looks like the tails of these coats. And Empoleon is decked out in Napoleonic-era men's formal wear, as it looks like it's wearing a dark coat, tight pants, and a cravat. It's very Mr. Darcy. So yeah, the Piplup line, totally Regency core. Maybe that's why they've always been my favorite Gen 4 starter line. Now, I've heard a lot of people say Staraptor's hair makes it look like an emo kid or something like that. However, as an aficionado of all things 1980s, I am almost certain that Staraptor's hairstyle is actually based on, or at least inspired by, the seagull nest hairstyle worn by Mike Score, lead singer of the band A Flock of Seagulls, during the 1980s. I mean, come on! The horns on either side of the head, the lock of hair hanging down over one eye, it's all there! Kricketune has a bushy, curly moustache, and it appears to be wearing a tailcoat of some kind and a black cape. While this is likely just based on the white tie dress codes of many professional classical orchestras, to me, this outfit reads as very Victorian, especially that mustache. And as it turns out, the Victorian era, heck, the entire 19th century, was by far the greatest era for classical music. In classical music circles, this era is known as the Romantic era, and it produced some of the greatest composers of all time, including my personal favorite composer, Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky. And looking at Kricketune, I personally think it closely resembles Johann Strauss II, a Romantic composer known for his waltzes and operettas. You're probably very familiar with his Blue Danube Waltz. Strauss's works make heavy use of string instruments, which is very fitting for Kricketune, because its body looks like a violin and its arms look like violin bows. I'm getting some late 18th century vibes from Roserade. Its white hair resembles a powdered wig, and it looks like it's wearing tights and a coat with tails. And masquerade balls were quite popular in the 18th century. However, I'm not entirely sure that the 18th century is the only inspiration, as I've seen pictures of masquerade balls where people were wearing tights since the 17th century, and its high-collared cape is actually more of a 19th century thing. So Roserade is a weird case where it looks historical, but it's hard to pinpoint which era it's from. I guess that's to be expected from a Pokémon with a masquerade theme. Masquerade balls have fallen in and out of fashion multiple times over the centuries. Vespiquen is literally just Elizabeth I of England. I mean, seriously, you cannot tell me they didn't have Queen Elizabeth I in mind when they designed this Pokémon. It's so obviously inspired by late 16th century women's fashion. Vespiquen's head shape is very reminiscent of how a lot of noble women wore their hair during the 1570s, 1580s, and 1590s, complete with a jewel on her forehead. In addition, her body shape resembles the nipped waists and wide farthingales that were common during this era. There were a lot of eras where small waists and big skirts were common in fashion, but Vespiquen's hair strikes me as specifically Elizabethan. And, I mean, it's a queen bee, and Elizabeth I was one of the most famous queens in history. Baniri may just look like an ordinary bunny, but it also kind of looks like it's wearing a pencil skirt and pillbox hat, which was a popular formal wear look in the 1960s. Jackie Kennedy famously wore such an outfit when her husband was shot in 1963. Baniri's hat could also be seen as a beret, which was also popular in the 60s. Its evolution, Lopunny, however, has a lot more fashion history elements in its design, mainly because it looks more like a human being. It's based on the famous Playboy bunnies, pretty young women who worked at Playboy clubs, a chain of bars run by the Playboy magazine company that were popular in the 60s and 70s, but are now all but extinct due to Gloria Steinem's expose about their terrible working conditions, protests from feminist groups, and waning interest in the Playboy brand. The Playboy magazine was at its peak in the 1970s, and fittingly, Lopunny has kind of a 70s look to its design. The little poofs of fur on its arms, and the fact that its arms are skinny at the top and chunky at the bottom, make it look like it's wearing a top with bishop sleeves, which were super popular in the 70s. The light fur on its legs that goes up to its knees resembles a tall pair of boots, and knee-high boots were very popular in the 70s. And its ears look like long hair that tapers downwards, with a couple extra tufts of hair on its head that flick outwards. This is very reminiscent of the popular women's hairstyles of the time, like the famous Farrah Fawcett hairdo. Mega Lopunny then jumps forward another decade, going for an 80s fitness wear look. The fur on its feet now resembles sneakers with leg warmers, its hair-like ears are tied with scrunchies, it's wearing fingerless gloves, and there are now black patterns on its fur that make it look like it's wearing a leotard and tights. So with this line, we kind of see an evolution of style from the 60s to the 70s and into the 80s. Now, Honchkrow clearly has a mob boss thing going on, and organized crime has existed throughout several points in history and in several parts of the world, so there's no single unified way for a mobster to look. However, its visual appearance is most reminiscent of Prohibition-era American gangsters, such as Al Capone. The reason I say this is because of its fedora, a type of hat that became very popular in the Roaring Twenties due to Edward, Prince of Wales often wearing them. Fedoras remained popular for men into the 50s, but then fell out of favor. Nowadays, they're mostly associated with Indiana Jones and dorky Redditors trying way too hard to look cool. The white patch on its body also makes it look like it's wearing a suit with an open jacket, and back in the 20s, suits were still considered everyday wear. Perugly is supposed to be, well, ugly, but more so in a grouchy older woman type of way. And when you look at the 2006 release date of Pokémon Diamond and Pearl, you'll notice that Perugly's appearance evokes a lot of 2000s fashion faux pas. First of all, its purple eyelids. In the mid-2000s, purple eyeshadow was considered deeply unflattering. I owned this book when I was a kid called The Big Book of Girl Stuff that was basically an all-inclusive guide to being a teenage girl, which was published in 2006. There's a section on how to do your own makeup, and on page 191 it gives the following beauty tip. Remember, nobody has naturally purple eyelids unless they've been hit in a boxing match! Second, it uses its tail as a waist cincher. The corsets of the Victorian and Edwwardian eras, while they were usually just used to support the breasts, were often tight-laced by more vain individuals in order to get a teeny tiny waist. However, after corsets fell out of fashion, people started talking about how women tight-laced so much that they fainted all the time, and it shrunk their ribs, and it prevented women from going out and doing anything and forced them to stay indoors, etc. And tons of movies about the past would have a scene where a woman gets tight-laced into a corset or that era's equivalent and complains about it. Later waist-training garments, like the girdle, would be largely rejected by the baby boomers in the 1960s due to the popularity of crop tops, and exercise and dieting became the go-to way to reduce the size of a belly. So by the 2000s, the idea of someone wearing a waist cincher was considered extremely old-fashioned, especially since, by that point, liposuction had become quite popular and available at many clinics. And third, the pattern on its chest looks like it's wearing clothes that are all ripped up. Distressed-looking clothing that wasn't jeans didn't become popular until the late 2010s, so it was still considered inappropriate to wear clothes that are clearly ripped and torn. Remember when I said Blissey reminded me of a 1950s housewife? Well, as it turns out, Happini looks kind of 1950s to me as well. It has curly bangs, which were very popular in the 50s among women and girls, including First Lady Mamie Eisenhower, and its hair is in a high ponytail, which, while almost never seen on adults back then, was very popular among young girls in the 50s. The fact that it plays with a rock and pretends it's a baby also reminds me of how, in the 50s, most of the dolls available on the market were baby dolls. In fact, Barbie was invented in the late 50s because its creator, Ruth Handler, felt that there weren't any dolls for girls that looked like adults. Now, Riolu and Lucario obviously have an ancient Egyptian thing going on, as they're based on Anubis, the god of embalming and funerals. And that does explain why they appear to have black shoulder-length hair, as men in ancient Egypt would often wear shoulder-length black wigs. However, what's with those shorts? Ancient Egyptians didn't wear shorts, they wore linen tunics and skirts. However, there were certain styles of wrapping skirts that were more segmented and would look more like short pants to us today. In addition, they also remind me a bit of the harem pants that were worn in much of the Islamic world, including Egypt, back during the days of the Ottoman Empire. So it's still something that would have been worn in Egypt, just a couple millennia off. Speaking of ancient Egypt, Weavile has a few ancient Egyptian influences in its design. It appears to be wearing an usak collar, which a lot of ancient Egyptians wore as jewelry, and the feathers on its ears look like big, chunky earrings, which were also popular in ancient Egypt. Ancient Egyptian jewelry was often heavy and conspicuous, in order to stand out against the simple linen clothes that people wore. As for the thing on its head, it looks a lot like a cap crown, which was worn by royalty during ancient Egypt's New Kingdom period. The famous Nefertiti bust depicts Queen Nefertiti wearing this headdress. It's even wearing some eye makeup, which ancient Egyptians wore a lot of in order to protect their eyes from the sun. While the poof on Licky Licky's head may just be to resemble a curled up tongue, and while its white marking on its chest may just be to resemble a napkin tucked into one's shirt, Licky Licky's design also bears some resemblance to macaroni fashion, popular in the mid to late 18th century. Macaroni fashion originated with young British men who traveled to Italy and were fascinated with the local culture, hence why they named their new style after a type of pasta. It was a very maximalistic style, using a variety of accessories and the loudest colors that natural dyes could make. Characteristics of this style included a short and tight-fitting coat, a lacy white cravat, and a wig that was teased up to be very, very tall. For my fellow Americans, that line in the song Yankee Doodle where they mention macaroni is referring to this style of fashion. You see, the Yankee Doodle sticks one feather in his hat and thinks that's maximalist enough to be considered macaroni. It'd be like if I put one barrette in my hair and called it Decora. So, with Licky Licky's big hair, lacy cravat, and brightly colored, well, everything, macaroni fashion may have inspired its design. Like the rest of its evolutionary family, Gilded has some elements from medieval European knights, as its body is structured like a suit of armor and its head looks like a helmet, especially those that were worn in the 15th century, the same time period that Curlia and Gardevoir take inspiration from. Even its arm blades might be based on how the things that medieval knights wore on their elbows could be quite pointy. However, there's also some ancient Greek and Roman inspiration, as its helmet shape resembles the helmets of Greek hoplites and Roman gladiators. Its mega evolution gets a cape, which was a very popular garment in, once again, medieval Europe. However, its cape also kind of looks like a pair of wings, which reminds me of the Winged Hussars, a formation of Polish heavy cavalry that were known for their amazing battle capabilities. The band Sabaton wrote a whole song about them. As their name suggests, they wore wings on the backs of their armor to intimidate their foes, and many would also wear capes. Mega Gilded's helmet even kind of looks like the helmets that the Hussars would wear. Dusk Noir looks like it's wearing an upturned collar, which was trendy in the 2000s when Pokémon Diamond and Pearl was being made. However, upturned collars were the norm in the 18th and 19th centuries, and in the 1890s specifically, collars that looked like Dusk Noirs were very popular on coats and cloaks. And fittingly, considering Dusk Noir is a ghost type and takes people's souls to the afterlife, the 19th century was a time when a lot of people were thinking more about death. This was the time when Mary Shelley, Bram Stoker, and Edgar Allan Poe kickstarted the Gothic horror genre. This was the time when it was societally expected for you to wear black for up to 4 years after losing a relative. This was the time when seances became really, really popular. So I'd say that a Victorian look fits with a Pokémon associated with death. Cresselia has 3 interconnected circles that wrap around her body, which resembles a traditional Chinese scarf called a pibo, which were worn with hanfu during the Tang Dynasty. Pibo were made of sheer silk and often looped around the back so it drapes over one's shoulders. Many depictions of gods, goddesses, and other holy figures in Chinese mythology would often have them wear floating pibo that formed a halo around their head. Since most legendary Pokémon are gods of some variety, believe me, I could go on and on about all the headcanons I have regarding the worship and patronage of legendaries of the Pokémon world and what each legendary is the god of, it makes sense that Cresselia would have something that looks like this garment, which designates her as a divine being. In addition, the combination of the pibo and her body being primarily blue in color may have been derived from most depictions of Chang'e, the goddess of the moon, in Chinese mythology. Cresselia's archenemy, Darkrai, goes for a look that's a bit more contemporary than the Tang Dynasty. Immediately, I'm reminded of 1980s goth fashion. The all-black clothes, the collar-like thing around its neck, the nipped-in waist, the big shoulders, the messy hair, it's all very trad goth. The visual kei rock subculture in 1990s Japan may have also been an inspiration, and the hair over one eye may have been inspired by the emo subculture, which was popular while the game was being made. However, if you look closely at Darkrai's 3D model in Pokémon Scarlet and Violet, you'll find that its hair looks like it's made out of fabric. With this in mind, what we assumed was its hair may actually be a nightcap. Nightcaps were commonly worn to bed in Northern Europe from the Middle Ages to the 20th century and were especially popular in Victorian times. While nightcaps fell out of fashion after World War II, they still often show up in pop culture. The hat Kirby gets with the sleep ability, for example, is a nightcap. And Darkrai is a Pokemon heavily associated with sleep, as it has the ability to put people to sleep and give them horrible nightmares. Shaymin's sky form looks like it's wearing an ascot, a kind of neck scarf that was popular in the 1970s. It's that thing that Fred from Scooby-Doo wears. Coincidentally, the 70s was also when environmentalism rose to prominence as a movement, as both Earth Day and the Environmental Protection Agency were created in 1970, which fits with how Shaymin cleans up the environment. Shaymin's land form also looks like a chia pet, which were first introduced in 1977, and it even has a big ol' mop of hair like everyone in the 70s did. There's a lot to talk about with Gen 5. It introduced more new Pokémon than any generation before or since, and it was the point when Pokémon design started getting really complicated. And with a big cast means a lot of stuff that can be talked about in this video. Just to give you an idea of how deep this Bunnelby hole goes, all 3 starter Pokémon in this generation have blatantly obvious historical fashion inspirations. First, let's look at the Snivy line. According to Ken Sugimori, the art director for generations 1 through 7 of Pokémon, the Snivy line was inspired by the manga The Rose of Versailles, which is set in France during the late 18th century. So naturally, these Pokémon have a lot of elements of 18th century fashion. The collar-like parts on Snivy, Servine, and Serperior resemble the upturned collars that were omnipresent in menswear at the time, as well as the lacy details around the neck, which were common in women's fashion at the time, especially in France. Snivy even looks like it's wearing a long coat. Servine continues to look like it's wearing a long coat, but now it has a pattern on its belly that makes it look like it's wearing a waistcoat, and its little feet look like shoes with heels, which remind me of the shoes with the low heel and the buckle on them that basically everyone wore back then. Serperior's collar is maximally popped, its hands are tucked behind its back like a proper gentleman, and its body is adorned with gold embellishments, which were common on the clothes of French aristocrats. It also has a fleur-de-lis on its chest, which was the symbol of the French monarchy. In addition, Serperior's face is completely white, reflecting how white face makeup was often used by the upper class in the 18th century to give the appearance of pallor, which, during an era where most people worked in agriculture, signified that you were so rich you didn't have to work outside, as well as to cover up facial blemishes, kind of like how concealer is used today. And the fact that its head is a lighter green than before and looks like hair pulled tightly back reflects the powdered wigs pulled back into ponytails that were popular during this time. The Tepig line, according to Ken Sugimori, was designed to look Chinese. It was specifically inspired by Zhu Bajie from the Chinese folktale Journey to the West, which is set during the Tang Dynasty in the 600s. The swirly patterns on Pignite and Embor are a traditional design often used in old Chinese art, which is meant to look like rolling clouds. Like in many world religions, the Chinese believed that their gods lived in the sky, so symbols that evoked the sky were used to invoke the gods' blessings. The fact that they're yellow also brings to mind the gold embroidery that adorned the silk garments of Chinese aristocrats. Moving on to Embor, its body does resemble the armor worn by infantry during the Tang Dynasty, especially in regards to the pattern on the chest. However, Sugimori stated he had some earlier inspirations for Embor as well, as he was inspired by Zhang Fei, a military general from the Three Kingdoms period, which lasted from 220 to 280. Zhang Fei served under the warlord Liu Bei and fought in many battles, including the famous Battle of the Red Cliffs. He was described as having a big beard, which Embor certainly has, and while we don't know for sure what his precise body type and facial structure was, as most records of his life were text only, most depictions portray him as husky and with hairy eyebrows. Again, much like Embor. Many artistic depictions of Zhang Fei also depict him as having a wide sash around his waist and wearing clothing with swirl patterns, much like Embor. And the fact that the flame beard separates Embor's head from its body may be a reference to how Zhang Fei died: decapitation. The Oshawott line is, of course, based on Japanese samurai, especially those of the Edo period, which lasted from 1603 to 1868. Oshawott and Duwatt's scalchops might just be scallop shells, but they also kind of look like Japanese iron fans, or tessen, which were commonly carried by samurai as a secret weapon to use in places where swords were not allowed. When we get to Duat, however, it has a tuft of fur on the back of its head that resembles a chonmage, a hairstyle that was commonly worn by men in the Edo period. Nowadays, you only really see it on sumo wrestlers. It also looks like it's wearing a skirt or kilt of some kind with a split down the middle, which is reminiscent of the split hakama that samurai and other high-ranking men wore over their kimono in the Edo period. Its feet are also black, which reminds me of how many samurai would wear dark-colored socks underneath their zori sandals, probably because dark colors won't show dirt stains or blood stains. Finally, both the Unovan and Hisuian forms of Samurott are wearing what looks like a samurai helmet combined with a conch shell. Those samurai helmets typically have 2 horns rather than 1, and they have this kind of layered armor plating on their legs that resembles traditional Japanese armor. Its tail also kind of looks like a folding fan, which were commonly used in East Asia, including by samurai, as I previously mentioned. Samurott also has a mustache and a beard, and it was very common for elder samurai to have mustaches and beards, especially when you look at photographs of samurai from the end of the Edo period. This is probably because the only thing available to shave with in the Edo period looked like this, and worked best on the top of the head rather than on the face, so they just kinda let their mustaches grow out. Herdier appears to be wearing a little cape and has a nice thick mustache, and Stoutland's mustache is even thicker and its cape is a full-on cloak. Well, these may just be because some people put similar looking coats on their dogs in the winter, and several breeds of dogs do look like they have facial hair, including the Yorkshire Terrier and Scottish Terrier, the breeds these Pokemon are primarily based on. I'm also getting some Victorian vibes from these Pokemon. Thick facial hair was a huge trend in Victorian times, beginning in the late 1850s when soldiers came home from the Crimean War with thick beards because they didn't have any barbers out on the battlefield. And during cold or damp weather, it was common to wear a cloak or a cape in Victorian times, hence why most depictions of Sherlock Holmes have him wearing some kind of cloak. The Victorian inspiration does make sense for these Pokemon though, as the first modern dog show was held in 1859 in Great Britain, and the practice of sorting dogs into breeds also originated in Victorian times. Simisage is inspired by 1950s greasers, as well as Japanese Yankee delinquents, whose style is inspired by greasers. First of all, it has a huge pompadour, which was a very popular hairstyle for young men in the 50s. Many celebrities of the day, like Elvis Presley, Little Richard, and James Dean, sported this hairstyle, and it became very common amongst greasers. The pompadour became popular in Japan in the 1980s and 1990s, especially among delinquents. Josuke Higashikata from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Diamond is Unbreakable, which came out in the 90s, famously sports this hairstyle. In addition to the pompadour, Simisage looks like he's wearing a jacket and a pair of pants, and leather jackets and jeans were staples of any greaser's wardrobe and are popular amongst Yankee delinquents too. Simisir is inspired by biker gangs, like the Bosozoku in Japan or Hell's Angels in the USA. This is why its tail looks like a cloud of exhaust, and why its hands are positioned as if it's holding onto handlebars. Biker gangs emerged in the USA during the late 1940s, as servicemen who returned from World War II wanted to recreate the feeling of facing danger with a team of friends that they'd experienced during wartime. They later grew in popularity in the 1970s, with many Vietnam War veterans joining biker gangs for similar reasons that World War II vets started the whole thing, but with an added layer of trauma-induced misery that they wanted to channel through wearing black leather and getting skulls tattooed on their arms. The 1970s was also when Bosozoku culture emerged in Japan, with membership peaking in the 1980s. You can see some reflections of 70s and 80s biker culture in Simisir's design. Its hair is very 1980s, as many men during that time wore big, tall, spiky hairdos. It also appears to be wearing a jacket with a fur-lined collar. Leather jackets with collars lined with fur or fleece were, and still are, commonly worn by military pilots. Recall that most people in biker gangs back in the day were ex-military. So it's not surprising that bikers back in the day would wear that. And its hands give it the appearance of wearing fingerless gloves, which were, and still are, commonly worn by motorcyclists to better grip their handlebars. Rounding out the elemental monkeys, Simipour goes for a swinging 60s look, with a miniskirt and very, very big hair. Good taste! Its white eyelids also give it the appearance of wearing white eyeshadow, which was a popular color for eyeshadow in the 1960s. It's also inspired by the gyaru subculture in Japan, which was very popular in the 90s and 2000s and was inspired by Western fashion, especially in places like California. While there are several gyaru subtypes, generally, gyaru is characterized by meticulously styled hair, dramatic eye makeup, and revealing outfits that show a lot of leg. And wouldn't you know it, gyaru, especially the hime gyaru subtype, has some 1960s influences, as they often have long, curly, teased-up hair, short hemlines, and light-colored lipstick. If you look closely, you'll notice that Tranquil has hair that reaches its shoulders and has fluffy curls on the ends. This hair reads to me as very late 60s or early 70s, when long hair with flipped ends was extremely common among women and even among some men. I'm pretty sure they gave Tranquil this hairstyle because it was popular among hippies, who were all about peace and love, and some of Tranquil's Pokédex entries talk about how they live in peaceful communities where there is no war. Timber clearly has a pompadour and hair pulled back in a low ponytail. The low ponytail is quite easy to explain. For as long as the style has been around, it's been a common way for long-haired people to pull their hair back while exercising or doing a physically demanding job. The pompadour, though? Well, from the 1920s to the 1960s, pompadours were popular among young men from working-class backgrounds, and continued to be popular in places with large Italian-American populations, such as the New York City metropolitan area, which Unova is based on. Considering timber is the youngest member of its evolutionary line, and said evolutionary line is based on construction workers and other blue-collar workers, the hairstyle does make sense. The swaddle line is themed around sewing, so of course they have some fashion inspirations. First of all, swaddle itself looks like it's wearing a bonnet. Bonnets were popular for women in the 19th century, but sometime in the early 20th century, they fell out of fashion in favor of sun hats. However, babies continued to wear bonnets to protect their bald heads from sunburn, and still do so in the present day. Swadloon looks like it's wearing some kind of wrapped cloak or cape. While the intention here was probably just to look like a stereotypical hikikomori, someone who is too shy to leave their house, it's worth noting that capes and cloaks were commonly worn with fancy outfits during America's Gilded Age, which lasted from the 1870s to the 1900s. During the Gilded Age, New York City gained its reputation as a city of glitz and glamour, where fashionable people could meet up at fancy parties. Finally, Levani's long tailcoat covering its abdomen, its pants, and the leaves around its head somewhat resembling a popped collar could be evocative of a white tie tuxedo. Invented during the 19th century, the white tie tuxedo became a staple of ultra-formal events well into the 20th century. However, in the later half of the 20th century, they were largely displaced by black tie tuxedos, and rarely anyone wears them nowadays unless they're royalty. Levani's outfit can also be seen as evocative of 1870s and 1880s women's wear. Its legs look like Victorian drawers worn under dresses, its abdomen looks like an overskirt with a bustle, its arms look like long bishop sleeves, and the tall leaves on its head evoke the very vertical hairstyles and hats of the time. However, I'm fairly convinced that contemporary 2000s fashion trends influence Levani the most. I mean, it's wearing capri pants. The bishop sleeves may have been influenced by the boho chic trend of the mid-2000s, when a lot of early 70s styles came back into fashion. And as for the leaves around its head, hair was pretty vertical in the 2000s, and popped collars were all the rage. Its top is also V-necked, which was very popular in the 2000s. Lilligant was designed to look like an extravagant princess, and fittingly enough, its design draws inspiration from mid-18th century women's fashion, especially those worn by the upper class. Dresses from this time period usually had huge skirts and lace around the neckline, which we can see reflected in Lilligant's design. Women would also often wear flowers in their hair as decoration during this time period. Lilligant's feet even look similar to the kinds of shoes worn during this time period. But speaking of her shoes, don't they look kind of Middle Eastern? Well, another possible inspiration is the clothes that were worn by women in Turkey and the surrounding area during the time of the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman women's wear consisted of baggy pants, a short overdress or top, a robe, and in many cases some kind of veil or headdress to cover their head, often accompanied by a hat. This style of clothing was the inspiration for bloomers, which were an Americanized take on Ottoman women's clothing that was popular in the 1850s, especially on the American East Coast. Lilligant's lower body might be a pair of Ottoman-style puffy pants, and her flower and long head leaf may be an Ottoman hat with a veil. So she could very well be an Ottoman lady, or a woman from the 1850s wearing bloomers. Lilligant's Hisuian form, however, is a very modern figure skater. Weird how the ancient regional variant in the 19th century Pokémon game looks way less historical than its base form. Though Hisuian Lilligant's hairstyle does remind me of Dorothy Hamill, a famous figure skater from the 70s, so it's still a little vintage. Sandile looks like it's wearing big, round sunglasses, which not only fits with a desert Pokémon, but also reflects 2000s fashion trends. Huge, round, bug-eyed sunglasses were in back then, with Paris Hilton, Nicole Richie, and the Olsen twins commonly wearing this style. Krokorok's half-lidded eyes more closely resemble sporty wraparound sunglasses, which were popular earlier in the 2000s. And once we get to Crocodile, its sunglasses have a more retro cat-eye look. This style was popular in the 50s and 60s, but wasn't really mainstream in the 2000s. However, in the 90s and 2000s, there was a trend of villains and anti-heroes in anime wearing huge, pointy cat-eye sunglasses, possibly due to their resemblance to demon horns. So these triangle shades became very popular amongst geeks, especially those who were into anime. Bro Strider from Homestuck wears a similar pair. Scraggy and its evolution Scrafty are heavily inspired by street gangs, as the Pokédex describes them as living in tightly knit groups and being very territorial. Fittingly, they're dressed in what seems to be 1990s style clothes, as the 90s was an era in American pop culture where a lot of movies and music were being made about urban street gangs. First, let's talk about those pants. They are massive! The 90s was a time when pants were very baggy and often had very wide legs, sometimes wide enough for you to fit your whole body through. In addition, the practice of sagging, or wearing jeans so low on your hip that you leave your underwear exposed, also originated during this time. Throughout the 90s and 2000s and even into the 2010s, sagging was extremely popular amongst young men and teenage boys, including those in urban street gangs. I remember growing up in the early 2010s and seeing plenty of teenage boys sagging their pants out in the wild. Scrafty is also wearing a hoodie, which skyrocketed in popularity during the 1990s as an everyday garment rather than just workout or cold weather wear. In addition, for many years, it's been pretty common for petty criminals to wear coats with the hood up, so that witnesses have a harder time seeing their faces. This includes urban street gangs, especially those that operate in cities with cold winters, like the inspiration for Unova, New York City. Scrafty also has a bit of 70s and 80s inspiration with its mohawk hairdo, popular amongst punks and later goths. Because punks were also primarily composed of young people and had a strong sense of in-group, out-group mentality, it makes sense why it would be incorporated into this delinquent Pokémon. Chinchino obviously looks like it's wearing a fur coat or stole, which, during the mid-20th century, was the thing that women wanted to have in their wardrobe. Fur coats are expensive, so being able to buy one was considered a sign that you were living very comfortably, and wearing one on an everyday basis was considered a way to let everyone know how rich you were. Fur coats declined starting in the 1970s due to increased awareness of endangered species and the bleak conditions of many fur farms. The hair on Chinchino's head also puffs up at the top of the head and is very long, which reminds me specifically of women's hairstyles in the 1940s, which often had coiffed volume near the forehead and were much longer than hairstyles had been in the 20s and 30s. This, along with the fur coat, gives this Pokémon kind of an old Hollywood look. Fitting, considering this is the first region to be based on a part of the USA. The Gothita line is based on Gothic Lolita fashion, which was huge in Japan during the 2000s. Gothic Lolita is an offshoot of Lolita fashion, which originated in late 1980s Japan and broke into the fashion consciousness during the 1990s. Lolita fashion, which, by the way, has nothing to do with the book of the same name, is a cute and elegant style inspired by Victorian and Rococo fashions, especially the book Alice in Wonderland, with the goal of looking like a fancy doll. Gothic Lolita in particular borrows elements from American goth fashion, such as black clothes and occult iconography, and leans more heavily into the Victorian inspiration. Having dabbled in Gothic Lolita fashion back in college, I can say these three are certainly dressed the part, with black clothes, lots of ribbons, and voluminous pigtails. However, Gothitel's dress does not resemble the bell-shaped dresses worn by Gothic Lolita ladies, but rather the dresses worn during the Edwardian era, which lasted from 1901 to 1910. You know, the Mary Poppins era. And, wouldn't you know it, the Edwardian era was a time when spirituality was very popular in the USA, especially among women, with an increased interest in things like seances, tarot cards, and astrology. That last one is important because Gothitel is said to use the movements of the stars to predict the future, which is literally what astrology is. I wonder if it can let me know when Mercury is in retrograde. For Swanna, I'm kind of stretching the definition of vintage/historical fashion here, as its outfit is based on a theatrical costume, but this outfit has been around in its current form for so long and has such a unique history that I think it's worth talking about it. Swanna's design is based on the costumes worn by the ballerinas playing swans, especially the one playing the lead role of Odette in Tchaikovsky's famous ballet Swan Lake. In the original 1877 production, the dancers just wore white tutus, with Odette wearing wings and a crown to distinguish her. The 1895 revival by Marius Petipa, which made the ballet famous, kept the crown on Odette but added feathers to the swan's tutus. However, in 1905, choreographer Mikhail Fokine premiered The Dying Swan, a solo piece for Anna Pavlova, who was basically the Michael Jordan of ballerinas, set to Camille Saint-Saëns' The Swan from Carnival of the Animals. Pavlova's costume for The Dying Swan consisted of a white headpiece made of feathers that encircled her head and a tutu adorned with feathers that had a low neckline. Pavlova toured the world performing The Dying Swan, becoming extremely famous, and her costume ended up being the standard for what a swan should look like in a ballet. After 1905, the swans in Swan Lake began wearing similar feathered headpieces to copy Pavlova, either completely encircling the head or in a horseshoe shape. The horseshoe shape became the standard by about the 1950s and has been near universally worn in productions of Swan Lake ever since. In addition, the tutu's neckline was originally square, but during the 40s it got deeper and pointier and settled at a V-neck. Almost every production of Swan Lake since has had the swans wear V-necked tutus. The standardization of Swan Lake costumes after World War II probably had something to do with commercially printed sewing patterns, mass-produced costumes, quick and easy photography, better access to video cameras allowing for filmed productions, the Soviet Union holding up Swan Lake as a Russian cultural masterpiece and showing it off to the entire Eastern Bloc and to a lesser extent the world, or all of the above. So that's why Swanna looks like it's wearing a V-necked dress and a horseshoe-shaped feathered headpiece. Cavalier is obviously a jousting knight, and looking at different styles of plate armor from European history, I think it most closely resembles 16th century armor. Its helmet is most similar to the burgonet, a style of helmet from the 16th century with a large visor and crest. Burgonets were most common amongst cavalry, which, considering Escavalier is called the cavalry Pokémon, checks out. And while we're at it, Shelmet, the Pokémon Escavalier snatched that armor from, is also wearing a 16th century burgonet. Remember when I was talking about the ruff earlier with Slowking? Well, Frillish is also wearing a ruff, which, as a refresher, is a late 16th and early 17th century accessory common amongst the upper class, especially royalty. So they're going for sort of an Elizabethan or Jacobean look, which coincidentally lines up with how Europeans first came to what is now New York City in 1624. Very much within that era when all the European kings were wearing ruffs. Jellicent, however, is a lot less Jacobean and a lot more Victorian. When looking at male Jellicent and his big mustache, I'm reminded of Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria, Tsar Alexander II of Russia, King Alfonso XII of Spain, King Umberto I of Italy, and many other kings from the mid to late 1800s. As for female Jellicent, it was common for fancier Victorian day dresses, especially those worn by queens and princesses, to have some kind of lace around the neck area. Alexandra of Denmark, the wife of Edward VII, was known to wear either dresses with high collars or a variety of chokers in order to cover up a scar she had on her neck. Her sister, Tsarina Maria, the grandma from Anastasia, also liked to wear dresses with high lacy collars and choker-style necklaces, though hers were usually made of pearls. Hyan looks like it's wearing a trench coat, and its head kind of looks like a fedora. Trench coats were invented for soldiers in World War I, hence the name trench coat. However, they became very popular amongst civilians after the war, and when fedoras grew in popularity in the 20s, it only made sense for men to wear them with trench coats, hence why we see Humphrey Bogart wearing a fedora and trench coat in Casablanca. Because the trench coat was most fashionable in the 30s and 40s, it grew to be associated with film noir, and therefore detectives and spies. This, alongside the fact that it hides most of one's figure, led to the trench coat becoming seen as either a detective coat or a suspicious coat after it fell out of fashion. From about the 1970s onwards, we started seeing people or creatures wearing trench coats to hide their identity in media, and I think BEM is supposed to evoke this. It's supposed to be an alien after all, and a common trope in media involving aliens landing on Earth is the aliens attempting to blend in with humans and hide from the government. Golurk is primarily based on a golem, specifically the Golem of Prague, a Jewish folktale. However, its design also includes some Roman gladiator elements, specifically the tunic and the heavily armored shoulders, presumably to give it a more ancient look. The notch on its head also kind of looks like a top knot, which, in combination with the tunic and the fact that it's made out of clay, may point to the terracotta army, life-size statues of soldiers which were made during China's Qin dynasty to protect the emperor in the afterlife. poniard's armored appearance seems to be based on the armor worn by Ashigaru, the foot soldiers of Sengoku-era Japan. The Sengoku period was basically Japan's civil war, except instead of the North fighting the South or the Roundheads fighting the Cavaliers, it was a bunch of little territories all around Japan fighting every territory that wasn't them. It's a very common historical setting for Japanese fiction. When it evolves into Bisharp, it looks more like a samurai, the bosses of Ashigaru. It's wearing a kabuto helmet, its pointy shoulders resemble how samurai wore large shoulder pauldrons, its puffy pants resemble the knee-length gathered pants that several samurai wore, and its two-toed feet give the appearance of wearing zori sandals. So we're seeing the Sengoku period's chain of command here, from Ashigaru to samurai and eventually daimyo. And we'll get to that daimyo once we get to Gen 9. Bouffalante is extremely 1970s. First of all, it has a primarily brown and yellow color scheme, and earthy colors like that were very popular in the 1970s as a reaction against the bright psychedelic colors of the 60s. Second, it has an afro, which is like the definitive hairstyle of the 70s. The afro originated among African Americans in the 1960s as a part of the Black is Beautiful movement, an offshoot of the civil rights movement that encouraged African Americans to stop holding themselves to white beauty standards and be happy with who they are. It popularized natural curly hairstyles among African Americans, including the afro, which is the Black equivalent to long flowing hair. You see, because curly hair grows in a helix instead of a straight line, it takes a lot more time for it to get really long. However, all those helices in such close proximity end up very densely packed, more so than straight hair, so curly hair is a lot better at holding its shape. So when you grow out your curls, it kind of forms a bubble around your head. During the late 60s and early 70s, the hippie movement led to the popularization of natural hairstyles, i.e. styles you didn't need to do much with your hair to achieve, of which the afro was an example. But in the 70s, the afro went from a radical statement to a trendy do, popularized by pop stars like the Jackson 5, blaxploitation action movies, and eventually, disco fever. As a result, when people nowadays think of 1970s hairstyles, the afro is the first one they think of. Speaking of disco, Bouffalante is also wearing gold jewelry. Disregarding the question of how it was able to put it on without any hands, gold jewelry was a common accessory for disco dancers in the 70s, as it shined under the lights of the dance floor. So yeah, this is a disco bison. Makes sense, as Studio 54, the most famous disco club in the world, was located in New York City. Dino has a 2000s emo haircut. And it's covered in wounds. And it can learn hyper voice. If this wasn't intentional, it's one heck of a coincidence. I remember bringing up my Dino as a reference to emo kids theory on Bulbapedia and largely being ignored and dismissed. Cobalion, Terrakion, and Verizian are supposed to be based on the Three Musketeers, whose story is set in the 1620s. Their designs, fittingly, have a bit of a 17th century look. First of all three have designs around their feet that give them the appearance of boots, and 17th century musketeers did tend to wear very tall boots. Second, Cobalion has horns that extend upward in a diagonal direction, Verizian has horns that are positioned on either side of its head, and Terrakion has both horns that surround its head and a few spikes on the top of it. All of these vaguely suggest the idea of the feathered hats that were popular for men in 17th century France. Third, they all have some kind of thing on their shoulders, and most men in 17th century Europe wore doublets, which had pretty pointy shoulders. Fourth, Cobalion specifically looks to be wearing a cravat. For those not in the know, a cravat is a kind of old-fashioned necktie popular in the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries. It's that thing that Miles Edgeworth wears. Now, the cravat didn't become popular in Europe until the 1660s, but they look super cool, so I'll let it slide. Finally, Verizian has two leaves that extend outwards from its neck, which may reference the big collars that were very popular in the fashion world during the 1620s. Keltio, their apprentice, also has a 1620s look to it, as its horns and hair look like a big floppy hat and its chest fur looks like the rectangular cloak things that musketeers wore back then. It even gets a few feathers in its hat in its resolute form. Meloetta is supposed to be a goddess of music, and fittingly, it resembles a 2000s pop diva. And, as it happens, the word diva comes from the Italian word for goddess. Notice how its hair is long and straight and not in any kind of updo, as was trendy for women back then. Notice how its dress has an asymmetrical hem, a very trendy look for dresses in the aughts. Here's a photo of Beyoncé wearing one in 2003. Notice how it has what looks like a headset microphone, which is common for anyone singing at a venue. I did community theater for several years. You could always tell who had a lead role based on whether or not they were wearing a headset mic. And notice how, even though its hair is green, it's so pale that it almost looks blonde. The 2000s pop scene was full of blonde women. Jessica Simpson, Hilary Duff, Mandy Moore, Christina Aguilera, Avril Lavigne, Gwen Stefani, Kelly Clarkson, Shakira, Lady Gaga, and my personal favorite of the bunch, Britney Spears. In its pirouette form, it dyes its hair red and puts it in an updo. While the updo is obviously just to keep its hair out of its face when dancing or kicking people, the fact that its hair changes color may be in reference to how 2000s pop stars were known to dye their hair often. Remember when Christina Aguilera went from blonde to brunette and back to blonde? This generation introduced the Kalos region, which is based on France, the most fashionable country in the world. So, even though it introduced the fewest Pokémon, I still feel like I'll have a lot to talk about. Chestnut is based on a knight, and its armored body does bear some similarity to medieval and Renaissance era armor. Its body looks like it's covered in individual segments of metal, and its head looks like it's wearing a hood of chainmail. However, I feel like Chestnut's armor has more in common with the kind of armor seen in sci-fi and fantasy, rather than the armor worn by actual soldiers in history. This does make sense, as the Kalos starters are based on the character classes found in Dungeons & Dragons and the fantasy RPGs that were inspired by it. Chestnut is a paladin, Delphox is a wizard, and Greninja is a rogue. I was in the D&D club when I was in high school, so I know what I'm talking about here. Speaking of whom, Delphox is obviously a wizard or sorcerer of some kind, and the long robe and flowing sleeves do resemble most depictions of Merlin from Arthurian legend, the most famous wizard in fiction. However, its name, Delphox, is derived from the ancient Greek city of Delphi, where there was a huge temple to Apollo, the Greek god of light. The high priestess of this temple was known as the Pythia, or the Oracle of Delphi, and she was believed to be able to predict the future by looking at smoke from burnt laurel leaves. Why do I bring this up? Well, most depictions and descriptions of the Oracle of Delphi describe her as wearing a white robe with a dark red or reddish-purple cloak. Now compare this to Delphox, who is a fire psychic type, stares at the fire on its wand to see the future, has a very feminine appearance, and whose color scheme prominently uses white and dark red, especially on the clothing part of its body. So there's a bit of ancient Greek inspiration too. Greninja is, of course, based on a ninja, and a lot of its design is based on pop cultural ninja stereotypes. Real ninjas, for example, didn't wear brightly colored accent scarves. They covered their mouths with a cloth, yes, but it usually was more subtle and matched the rest of their outfit. However, Greninja's coloration is surprisingly accurate to real-life ninjas. Despite what Hollywood might tell you, real-life ninjas never actually wore black. That's a misconception that was started by kabuki theater. The stagehands in kabuki shows traditionally wore black, and the audience was expected to just ignore them. So, in order to depict a ninja attacking someone, they'd have a stagehand jump out and attack the main characters to make it seem like they came out of nowhere. In real life, if a ninja wasn't wearing one of their many disguises, they would usually wear dark blue, which in a time before light pollution, helped them blend in with the night. So Greninja's normal form is more accurate to real ninjas than its shiny form. While male Pyroar has a standard lion's mane, female Pyroar has a long tuft of fur extending back from its head. Real lionesses do not have this. But this does resemble the long, tight, sleek ponytails that were popular among women around the release of Pokémon X and Y and for many years after that. It's that style that Ariana Grande made her signature look. I certainly had many classmates who wore their hair like that back then. Even I did it occasionally. Florges' body shape and head shape remind me of Edwardian women's fashion. Its body has an S-curve shape and looks as if it's wearing a tight-fitting skirt, perhaps a hobble skirt, which was most trendy from 1908 to 1914, and its flowers look like large puffy hair, a staple of the Gibson girl look that was popular at the time. Its flowers could also be a richly decorated hat, also popular at the time. Fittingly, there was a growing fascination with fairies during the Edwardian era, especially in places like Ireland and Scotland, which were rediscovering their Celtic roots, as fairies and fae creatures played an important role in Celtic folklore. In fact, Peter Pan, the most famous work of fiction involving fairies, was written by a Scot during the Edwardian era. And Florges' whole evolutionary line is pure fairy type and based on the common association of fairies with flowers, which was common in Victorian and Edwardian times. And tying into how the region is based on France, the Edwardian era is part of France's Belle Époque, or Beautiful Era, an unprecedented era of peace, prosperity, and technological advancement in France. Ganguro is based on Japanese delinquents of the 80s and 90s. It wears a long black coat, which was a common fashion statement for male delinquents during this time. See also Jotaro Kujo. It also has a twig of bamboo in its mouth, which references how the leader of a Japanese delinquent gang would often chew on a piece of straw or a blade of grass. In addition, the twig kind of looks like a cigarette, which is quite popular among teenage delinquents all over the world. Even before the health risks of smoking were well known, it was considered very naughty to smoke cigarettes before you were old enough to buy them yourself, so a teenager smoking a cigarette was usually some kind of delinquent. Finally, its fur is really tousled and messy, which was common amongst men's hairstyles in the 90s in general, not just among delinquents. Frou-frou! Oh boy, this is a lot. If you don't know, frou-frou's whole gimmick is that it has a multitude of different hairstyles. The heart, star, and diamond trims are fairly generic, but all the others have some kind of historical inspiration. Debutante? Well-off adolescents during the 1890s, 1900s, and 1910s, hence the big hat and long hair. Matron? It reminds me the most of a Dutch bonnet, but I also think it might be inspired by the cloche, a hat worn by many women in the 1920s. The long ears may be inspired by the dangly jewelry that was popular in the 20s. Dandy? Once again, it comes off as late Victorian or Edwardian, but it's most strongly inspired by men's formal wear at the time, with the tie and top hat. La Reine? Marie Antoinette. I mean, it's got the ringlets and the big beehive hairdo, and its name is literally French for the Queen. Kabuki? The exaggerated costumes in kabuki theater, popular in Japan's Edo period. In particular, the play Renjishi is a big inspiration. Pharaoh? The crowns and headdresses worn by the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, especially the double crown that they wore often in life and the funerary masks that they wore in death. Spritzy's face is based on the masks of plague doctors, who wore long, bird-like masks filled with sweet-smelling substances to drown out the stench of the bubonic plague. Contrary to popular belief, plague doctors did not exist during the Black Death in the 14th century. They started showing up during later outbreaks of bubonic plague in the 17th century. This makes sense, considering Spritzy is a bird and is also called the perfume Pokémon. However, instead of evolving into a cool ghost type that leans into the plague doctor imagery, like it should have, it evolves into Aromatisse, which is based on a can-can dancer. The can-can is a French music hall dance that became popular in the Victorian era and is heavily associated with France to this day. Can-can dancers wore dresses that showed a lot more leg than most casual Victorian dresses did, and because women back then wore pantalettes as underwear, which had a slit down the crotch so you could pee or poop without having to remove your whole outfit, their high kicks were very revealing. The most famous venue where the can-can was performed was the Moulin Rouge in Paris, which you may remember from a certain movie musical starring Obi-Wan Kenobi. In fact, the Moulin Rouge still exists and still has dancers performing the can-can there to this day. So it makes sense that they'd make a can-can dancer Pokemon for their France-based region, and why they'd combine it with another quintessentially French thing, the French perfume industry. You know Chanel No. 5? That perfume that Marilyn Monroe allegedly wore to bed? Yeah, that's a French perfume. The fossil Pokemon in Kalos are based on dinosaurs combined with royalty. This makes sense, because France used to have a monarchy but doesn't anymore. Their monarchy is extinct. Like the dinosaurs. First, let's look at Tyrantrum. As you can see, its head crest looks like a gold crown, which was very common amongst European kings for millennia. It also has a big spiky collar, which could reflect the ruffs worn among royalty and nobility in the 16th and 17th centuries, or it could also reflect the ermine-lined capes and cloaks that have been worn by kings since the early medieval period. That may also explain the 2 white stripes down its belly. The white stripes also give it the appearance of wearing a red robe. During the Middle Ages, scarlet, specifically the shade of scarlet derived from the Kermes scale insect, was the most expensive color to use for clothing dye, so kings and queens would often be clothed in scarlet robes. And finally, it has a white beard. Most kings in the Middle Ages had beards because they lived before the invention of shaving cream, and Charlemagne, the first king of what is now France, was one such example. So Tyrantrum seems to be based on a medieval king, hence why its Pokédex entries describe how it behaved like a king, and why its category is the Despot Pokémon. After all, Tyrantrum is based on the Tyrannosaurus rex, whose name means Tyrant Lizard King. Aurorus, meanwhile, is based on a medieval queen. In the Middle Ages, it was expected for women to cover their head in accordance with biblical customs, so medieval women, including royalty, would wear headdresses of some kind, usually made of cloth. The shape of Aurorus's Aurora Borealis sails, at this time of year, at this time of day, in this part of the country localized entirely upon its head, seem to reflect these headdresses, and remind me most of the sheer veils that well-to-do women wore in the 1300s and the double hennons that were worn by royalty and nobility in the 1400s. It also has markings on its head that look like a jeweled circlet crown, which were commonly worn with these 1300s sheer veils. In addition, its body is blue, which references how blue was a common color for ladies' dresses during the Middle Ages, due to its association with the Virgin Mary. The reason why these Pokemon have a medieval look to them might be because France rose to become a major superpower during the High Middle Ages, with so much influence that they convinced the English to call cow meat beef. Plus, a lot of things in Kalos are inspired by medieval stuff, like the Hanage line and the character of AZ. Holucha is based on a masked luchador, which had been common in Mexican lucha libre wrestling since the 1940s, when the masked El Santo made his debut. However, Holucha's inspirations go back even further than that. See, during the days of the Aztec Empire, which lasted from 1428 to 1521 in what is now Mexico, there was a special class of infantry soldier in the Aztec army called the Eagle Warriors. As their names implied, they would dress like birds when out on the battlefield, including a helmet that resembled a bird's head decorated with real eagle feathers. Looking at depictions of Eagle Warriors, I can certainly see some elements reflected in Holucha. Diance's look reminds me of the Rococo fashions of the mid-18th century, especially with those two diamonds that look like long ringlets and the other diamonds that look like a big poofy hairstyle. The fact that its megaform literally looks like it's wearing a ball gown only accentuates this. Rococo was a style of art and design that was all about pale colors and lavish ornamentation, which Diance has in spades. And going back to the French inspiration, France is where the Rococo style originated from, and if you go to France, you'll still find a few rooms and buildings done up in a Rococo style. Also, Mega Diance looks to me like this Rococo style chandelier in Venice, Italy. Time for my favorite Pokemon generation! This'll be fun! Decidueye is wearing a hooded cloak, resembling the cloaks that were often worn during the medieval era, especially in the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries. This was a time when archers, especially longbowmen, were extremely valuable assets in any army. In addition, the folkloric character of Robin Hood originated during the 13th century, and his stories were set during the 12th, specifically during the reign of King Richard I. Since Robin Hood is one of Decidueye's main inspirations, in fact, I once played through Moon with a Decidueye named Robin Hoot, I can see why they'd be inspired by medieval fashion when designing this Pokemon. Its Hisuian form, in addition to being based on Chikap Kamui, the Ainu god of success and prosperity, takes some inspiration from Japanese bowmen during the Sengoku period, who would often wear jingasa hats that look similar to the conical feathers around its head. Incineroar is based on pro wrestling heels, especially the manga Tiger Mask, which was released in 1968 and was about a heel wrestler who wears a tiger mask who ends up becoming a face. In the 1980s, New Japan Pro Wrestling introduced a real-life version of Tiger Mask as a promotional stunt, and he's become a stock character in Japanese pro wrestling ever since. Coincidentally, the 1980s was also when pro wrestling became mainstream, due to Vince McMahon gobbling up all the USA's wrestling fiefdoms and forming a vast empire that we now know as WWE. Even Cyndi Lauper, one of the most iconic pop stars of the 80s, loved pro wrestling and showed up at many pro wrestling matches. And looking at Incineroar, it has some 80s elements to its design. The bright, eye-bleeding shade of red, the pronounced shoulders, the strong brows, the tank top that shows off its muscles, even its whiskers kind of look like a mullet. Primarina gives me 18th century vibes. I'm especially reminded of the 1780s and 1790s, with the puffy hair, the frilly collar, and the headpiece. Considering it's an opera singer, this may be in reference to the operas that Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart wrote during these two decades, including The Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, and The Magic Flute. Now, the Poplio line is most strongly inspired by an opera from the 19th century, Ruggero Leoncavallo's Pagliacci. You know, the clown opera, as well as the idea of a singing mermaid or siren. But Primarina seems to have a soprano voice, and Mozart's operas are known for having some of the most famous and demanding soprano roles in all of opera. The Queen of the Night aria from the Magic Flute in particular is considered the Battletoads tunnel level of operatic arias, in that it's extremely hard, and being able to complete it without messing up is a bragging right. So maybe that was an inspiration. Remember how I said trench coats were synonymous with film noir and became seen as a stock costume trait for detectives? Yeah, that's part of the inspiration behind gumshoes. Its visual appearance draws a lot from detectives in film noir, or stylized crime dramas from the 40s and 50s. Examples of film noir movies include The Maltese Falcon, The Killers, and Gilda. Even its name comes from gumshoe, a slang term for detective. The tuft of yellow fur on Gumshoe's head resembles a flat cap, and the brown fur on its body resembles a trench coat, both of which were popular in the 40s and 50s. Ribombee is wearing a scarf, and let me tell you, in the 2010s when this game came out, scarves were huge. Every basic white girl in the 2010s was wearing some kind of scarf. Even my mom wore scarves. That is how deeply they were ingrained in the culture. So the scarf was likely added to make it look like a sweet young woman. Marini looks like it has long ombre hair with bangs. And it might just be me, but I feel like some 2010s hair trends are reflected in its design. Bangs came back into fashion, straight and wavy hairstyles were very dominant, ombre hair was very trendy, and dyed hair in unnatural colors, especially blue, was more common than ever before. That's where the stereotype of the blue-haired SJW came from. The Gamergate fiasco occurred in the 2010s, when blue was a trendy color for young people to dye their hair. Marini's hair-like tentacles specifically remind me of mermaid hair, a 2010s fashion trend where women would have long, ombre hair in shades of turquoise, blue, and purple. And well, it is a water type. This is probably a coincidence, but Laurentis' outfit kind of reminds me of a morning suit, a specific type of suit commonly worn in the 19th and 20th centuries to daytime formal events. It's still worn sometimes nowadays, but far less frequently. Traditionally, a morning suit consists of a long coat with tails, a waistcoat, and vertically striped pants. The petals on the top of Laurentis' body kind of look like a waistcoat. It has growths extending out past its hips that look like tails on a tailcoat, and its legs look like striped pants. In addition, nowadays, morning suits are most commonly worn at springtime and summertime formal events, like outdoor weddings, horse races, and Easter parades. And spring and summer are the times of year when flowers, like the orchids Laurentis is based on, are in bloom. Salazzle looks like she's wearing a romper. Rompers got their start as baby clothes, but in the 20s, women began wearing romper-type swimsuits. By the 40s and 50s, the romper, or playsuit as it was often called, became a stylish thing for women to wear to the beach or on a hot summer day. Rompers came back into vogue in the 1970s and in the 2000s, though again, usually as something to wear in warm weather. Looking at Salazzle, I can definitely see the swimsuits of the 20s and 30s and the playsuits of the 40s and 50s as a big inspiration. It's supposed to be an alluring Pokémon that attracts males with its pheromones, and back in those more conservative times, a woman's swimwear or beachwear was the most revealing thing you could see her in. So a lady with a nice figure in her swimsuit was bound to attract a lot of male attention. Keep in mind that Alola is based on Hawaii, a tropical archipelago with many beautiful beaches. Steenie and Sarina look like they're wearing bubble hem skirts, which was a trend in the 1980s. However, I'm pretty sure this is just a circumstantial result of translating the round shape of the mangosteen fruit to a human-like design. Besides, Sarina has more in common with 1960s fashion to me. First, she's wearing a miniskirt, which was invented in the 60s and spread like wildfire among fashionable young people. In the mid to late 60s, miniskirts and mini dresses were everywhere. Some mini dresses were so short that they looked more like a shirt than a dress. The neckline of Sarina's dress is also very high, and a lot of the mini dresses of the 60s had high necklines. Its hair is also long and has flipped ends, which was also very stylish at the time, and it's wearing what looks like long stockings or long boots, both of which were quite popular in the 60s. Passimian is heavily based on an American football player. This makes sense as Alola is based on Hawaii, which has a pretty successful college football team. However, its visual appearance lines up far more with football players from the early 20th century than modern football players. They usually wore long-sleeve sweaters, flared pants that tucked into their socks, and simple leather helmets. Looking at Passimian, the fur on its arms looks like a long-sleeve shirt, the fur on its legs is flared out and ends at the knees, and the melon rind on its head mainly covers the top of its head and doesn't have a face guard. Galisopod's heavily armored body is, once again, based on samurai armor. The overlapping plates, the piece that protects the crotch, the spikes on its head area, it's all there. It's said to be a skilled battler who takes advantage of its opponent's weaknesses, so the samurai motif makes sense. Drampa is based on a Chinese dragon, but I can also see some inspiration from historical Chinese methods of dress. First of all, it has long hair, a mustache, and a beard. Throughout much of Chinese history, people were forbidden from cutting their hair or shaving their facial hair, because it was believed that the body was a gift from one's parents, and to purposefully damage any part of the body was disrespectful to them. So most men in ancient China had long hair and, if they could grow them, mustaches and beards. In addition, the shape of its arms kind of looks like the flowing sleeves seen on many historical Chinese garments. Tapu Koko is based on Ku, the Hawaiian god of war, who is associated with hawks and roosters and is often depicted with feathers and sculptures. However, I also see some inspiration from a specific battle outfit worn by King Kamehameha I, the man who conquered and unified the Hawaiian Islands into a single kingdom in 1795. This battle outfit consists of a yellow helmet with a large crest, a reddish-orange sash, and a yellow cape that was 5 feet long. All of these were made from woven feathers plucked from yellow birds. Looking at Tapu Koko, its head crest looks very similar to that helmet, its waist looks like it has an orange belt, the fringes around it resemble the bottom of a cape, and the tiki part of its design envelops its body in much the same way that a cape does. The inspiration from King Kamehameha is very fitting for Tapu Koko, considering Kamehameha was a very devoted follower of Ku and was supported by many of his high priests. Alright baby, here comes my favorite part! It's Ultra Beast time! Nihilego, who is literally my favorite Pokemon of all time and I have a whole video explaining why, resembles a human girl wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a knee-length dress, and also appears to have long hair with bangs. At first, I was reminded of Edwardian children's clothing. It was common back then for young girls to wear shorter dresses and have their hair down, and when they were grown adults, to put up their hair and wear a full-length dress. And wide-brimmed hats were quite popular back then among women and girls. However, the cut of the dresses worn during this time doesn't really match up with how Nihilego's lower tentacles flare out and move. To me, Nihilego's design more strongly evokes the new look, a very feminine style introduced by Christian Dior in 1947, which became the defining style of the 1950s. The new look was characterized by a full skirt that went to the knees or lower, sleeves that were very form-fitting to the arms, and an overall feminine appearance. Hats that were worn with this look were usually wide-brimmed, much like Nihilego's head, and Nihilego's bangs resemble the bumper bangs that were popular during this time, with its forelocks also resembling the average length of 1950s hair. In fact, in my Nihilego video, the outfit I wore was inspired by 1950s women's wear due to the resemblance I picked up on between Nihilego and the new look. And being inspired by this style makes my Nihilego as a metaphor for alcoholism theory that I mentioned in that video even stronger. In the years after World War II, there was a big spike in alcohol consumption, which, while it may have just been because there was also a big spike in marriages during this time and people tend to drink a lot at weddings, was also because many people had been traumatized by what they saw in World War II. Because psychiatry was in its infancy back then, people who had traumatic experiences were unable to get help and thus turned to alcoholism. In addition, many women were pressured into leaving their jobs and staying at home to raise the family, which often left them feeling bored and depressed and drinking their sadness away. The increasing paranoia about nuclear war also contributed to people's anxieties and miseries, which, again, led to many people drinking to forget about their problems. A lot of people who grew up in the 50s were raised by alcoholic parents, the thing I said that Lusamine was a metaphor for. And in addition, the 50s was an era when a lot of media was being produced about outer space, especially alien invasions. This was due to a combination of Hollywood's practical effects becoming more sophisticated and allowing filmmakers to stretch their legs with movie concepts, and later on, the space race between the USA and USSR causing outer space to be on everyone's minds. So it makes sense that an alien invader Pokemon would have kind of a mid-century look to it. Unlike its counterpart Buzzwole, which looks like it's nearly or completely naked, Veramosa looks like it's wearing clothes, and I think its look is inspired by the supermodels of the late 1990s and early 2000s. Ever seen the show America's Next Top Model? Yeah, Veramosa looks like it would be on that show. It appears to be wearing a monochromatic white outfit with a ruffled top, hot pants, and stiletto heels, all of which were trendy during this time period. The gold accents on its body reflect how metallic accessories, usually gold or silver, were common during this era as well. And once again, it has the long, straight hair that every famous woman in the 2000s had. Celesteela is based on Princess Kaguya, a character from a Japanese fairy tale, and fittingly, its design resembles historical Japanese dress, particularly from the Heian period. Its lower body resembles a juni hitoe, a type of many-layered court dress worn by upper-class women, especially royalty and nobility, during Heian times. Juni hitoe are still worn today by the Japanese royal family, but only during ultra-formal occasions like coronations and weddings. Celesteela also has long, straight hair with bangs, which was the most popular hairstyle among noble women in the Heian period. Today, this hairstyle is even called the hime cut, or princess cut, because it was often worn by princesses. As such, most depictions of Princess Kaguya depict her with this hairstyle. Kartana, like Samurott, Bisharp, and Galisopod before it, is inspired by samurai, so its body looks like samurai armor. Its antennae resemble the horns that were often found on Edo period samurai armor, and those things jutting out of its shoulders resemble the shoulder pads that samurai wore. Oh yeah, I forgot that the Ultra Beasts aren't all grouped together in the decks. Magearna seems to be based on the maids and nannies of the 1890s, as it was made to care for a princess. However, considering it was made 500 years ago and its original coloration is primarily red and yellow, I think 16th century European ladies-in-waiting may also be an inspiration. The gear around its head resembles a French hood or these hats/hair accessories that Italian women wore. Its puffy sleeves resemble the dresses worn in Italy in the 1530s and 1540s. The big skirt reflects how skirts were pretty full at this point in history, and the red and gold coloration reflects how red gowns with gold trim were quite popular for high-status women at the time. Marshadow's helmet, with its head crest, resembles the helmets worn by Hawaiian soldiers back in the 18th century. Fitting, as Marshadow is based on the Night Marchers, spirits of dead Hawaiian warriors from the olden days. And ending this segment quite literally with a bang, we have Blacephalon. Blacephalon's design takes a lot of cues from Arlecchino, a character from Italian Commedia dell'arte theater. Commedia dell'arte originated in the early 1550s, but by the 1600s it developed an agreed-upon canon of characters for the actors to play. And when you look at Commedia dell'arte characters, you can really see that 17th century influence, with all the ruffs and tights under tunics. Arlecchino is characterized as a nimble trickster who is street-smart but not book-smart. He loves to eat, is in a relationship with Colombina, and carries around a slapstick, a hinged wooden paddle that makes a loud noise when it hits something. In fact, the term slapstick comedy derives from Arlecchino's slapstick. He usually wears a multicolored shirt with lacy white cuffs, tight multicolored pants, a ruff around his neck, white shoes, and a mask. Comparing Arlecchino to Blacephalon, I'm sure you can see many similarities. Even its foot stance is the same as Arlecchino's. This is probably because a lot of the stock traits associated with clowns derive from Commedia dell'arte, particularly the characters of Pedrolino and Arlecchino. And, as you're probably aware, Blacephalon is based on the idea of a creepy clown, as it resembles a stereotypical circus clown and feeds itself by scaring people. With the Galar region being based on the UK and the art director being an actual Brit, there are naturally going to be a lot of Pokémon in this gen based on British history and culture, including the fashions. So I've got quite a bit to work with here. Grookey and Thwackey both have spiky hair, though Thwackey's hair is in a bun when out of battle. Considering the Grookey line has a drummer theme, this reflects the common trend of rock musicians having spiky hair, which began with the punk scene in the 70s. Thwackey's hair even kind of looks like a mohawk, which, as I mentioned before, is the iconic punk rock hairstyle. When it evolves into Rillaboom, though, its hair becomes longer and literally bushier, which makes it very reminiscent of the long, curly hairstyles popular amongst heavy metal musicians, especially in the 80s. Like, it and Slash clearly go to the same hairdresser. This makes sense, as heavy metal music was invented in the UK, with the three bands often credited for birthing the genre, Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, and Deep Purple, all having originated in England. And even outside of the metal genre, there are tons of British rock bands that are super famous, including quite possibly the most famous rock band of all time. So Rillaboom looking like a metalhead makes sense. Cinderace is clearly based on a soccer or football player. I know we're talking about the UK here, but I'm American, so I'm just going to call it soccer. Okay? Okay. Again, this is a thing that the UK is known for, as the modern rules for soccer were first written down in Cambridge, England in 1848. However, Cinderace's shorts are considerably longer than the shorts usually worn in modern soccer. They look more like the bloomers that women wore when playing sports, including soccer, in the 1910s and 1920s. In addition, they kind of look like the jodhpurs that have been worn in English-style horseback riding since the 1890s. Horseback riding is another quintessentially English sport. Why do you think the style of horseback riding they do at the Olympics is called English riding? And the shape of Cinderace's head does kind of look like a helmet, such as the helmets that jockeys wear. Its name even contains the word race, like a horse race. Or maybe I'm just overthinking things and they lengthen the shorts so they can evenly transition into the socks. Drizzle's hairdo was a common hairstyle in the 2000s and was often worn by the emo subculture back then. This fits, as Sobble and Drizzle are said to be Pokemon that cry a lot. This type of hairstyle is often used in media to convey that a character is mysterious, which befits a Pokemon that can camouflage itself in water and evolves into a literal spy. Speaking of which, while Inteleon is clearly based on British spies and secret agents who were incredibly skilled at obtaining information during the Second World War and the Cold War, its visual appearance seems more so based on pop cultural stereotypes about what spies wear than what spies actually wear, which is, whatever helps them blend in. So, I don't really think Inteleon counts for the purpose of this video. Corvisquire looks like it's wearing a hood, which, considering the knightly theme of its evolutionary line, may be in reference to the chainmail hoods that were worn by soldiers, especially knights, in medieval Europe. The Bayeux Tapestry, that big piece of fabric that tells the story of the Norman conquest of England, shows several people wearing chainmail hoods. Its evolution Corviknight looks like it's wearing plate armor, which developed in the late Middle Ages and was usually worn over chainmail. It even gains the steel type to reference this. Blipbug appears to be wearing a bow tie and a pair of glasses, the latter of which it keeps when it evolves into Dottler. Specifically, its eyes are modeled after Windsor glasses, which date back to Victorian times. Glasses were pricier and more fragile back then, so in those days people would only put on glasses if they needed to read something. The only people who wore glasses all the time back then were people whose job required them to do a lot of reading, and since said jobs usually required a lot of education, glasses developed connotations of being educated and intelligent. The Blipbug line is said to be extremely intelligent and gains the psychic type when it evolves into Dottler, so it makes sense. It's also worth noting that Windsor-style glasses were famously worn by John Lennon of the Beatles, and the Blipbug line is based on ladybugs, which are a type of beetle. As for the bow tie, well, bow ties predate the modern necktie and are typically worn for very formal occasions. Therefore, at some point in the mid-20th century, they became associated with stuffiness and squareness. Likely due to this, they became stereotypically associated with teachers and other educators, as seen in the 1963 movie The Nutty Professor, in which the titular professor wears a bow tie, while his handsome alter ego, Buddy Love, wears a necktie. And the stereotype of teachers wearing bow ties would spread to other types of smart guys, like scientists, architects, doctors, and even politicians. So again, it serves to make Blipbug look like a nerdy intellectual. Thievul is mostly inspired by stereotypical depictions of robbers, with the black mask and the gloves, but its mustache also reminds me of Guy Fawkes. You know, the man who snuck into Parliament to try and blow it up in 1605? Remember the 5th of November and all that? Even the way its mask and snout look resemble the stylized depictions of Guy Fawkes that are burned in effigy on Guy Fawkes Night. Also, Guy Fawkes' surname sounds like Fox, so if it was an inspiration, it was probably a pun. Toxtricity is obviously based on punk rockers. Real punk rockers, not sellouts like the Ramones. The UK is home to a lot of famous punk rock bands, and in the 70s, London was considered the center of the punk rock scene, so the British region was the perfect place to introduce a punk rock Pokémon. In its amped form, it has a mohawk, and in its low-key form, its hairstyle resembles Liberty Spikes, or as I call it, shonen anime hair. They also have spikes on their bodies that look like spiked wristbands and a spiked belt, and the patterns on their legs look like ripped jeans or ripped tights. All of those were, and still are, very common in punk fashion. The hats that Hatenna, Hatrim, and Hatterene wear are primarily based on stereotypical witch and wizard hats, but they also have elements of hennin hats, a type of women's hat from 15th century Europe. Hatterine's hat especially looks like a hennin. Hennins were most common in France, but were also worn in other European countries, including England. Similarly to Galarian Slowking, being inspired by medieval fashion is very fitting for a Pokemon inspired by witches, as a lot of high fantasy stories are set in medieval times. Hennins are also stereotypically associated with fairy tale princesses, which does fit with how Hatterene is partially based on Rapunzel, especially in its Gigantamax form. Remember how I noted that Galarian Zigzagoon combines elements from all 4 members of KISS, but Galarian Lanoon leans more closely into Gene Simmons and to a lesser extent Paul Stanley? Well, Obstagoon is literally just Gene Simmons. The black spikes around the eyes, the widow's peak, the black lipstick, the messy hair, the tongue. Even the pattern of fur on its body resembles the costumes that Simmons usually wears. Apparently, shortly after Obstagoon was unveiled, Newsweek asked Gene Simmons himself how he felt about having a Pokemon based on him, and apparently, he loved it.
Pokemon has been a part of our household for decades, ever since our kids first discovered them, and to see Pokemon pay homage to KISS is flattering.
Berserker is, of course, based on a Viking, and while its horn-like ears are based on a pop-cultural stereotype mostly spread by productions of The Ring of the Nibelung, a series of 4 operas by Richard Wagner that are based on Norse mythology and are so iconic that the cliché of the fat lady in an armored dress singing opera actually comes from Brunhilde, a central character in the series, there are several elements of its design derived from what Vikings actually looked like. It's got a big bushy beard, which were very common amongst sailors of all kinds back before electric razors were invented. You see, in order to shave comfortably, you need to soak the area that you want to shave in fresh water. Salt water doesn't work for this purpose because it can irritate and even dry out the skin. On a ship at sea, salt water is all around you, but fresh water has to be brought along from somewhere else, and thus has to be conserved. Therefore, sailors just wouldn't shave and would let their beards grow out. In addition, the top of its head, horns aside, resembles a real Viking helmet that was found in Norway in 1943 and dated to the 900s. It has a ridge up top and guards around the eyes, kinda like how Berserker's head looks. Mr. Rhyme is based on English actor Charlie Chaplin, who was one of the biggest movie stars of the Roaring Twenties. His most famous character was the Little Tramp, a bumbling, mischievous homeless guy with a heart of gold. The tramp's clothes were designed to look very disheveled and contradictory. A bowler hat, baggy pants, a suit jacket that's clearly too small, shoes that are clearly too big, a mustache, and a cane. And Mr. Rhyme has all of these traits. Considering Chaplin was a silent movie star, it makes sense that they'd base an evolution of Mr. Mime on him, as mimes don't speak either. Realistically, Alcremie is just a cute and vaguely humanoid whipped cream creature. But considering strawberries and cream was invented in the court of Henry VIII, I feel like the shape of its hood may be based on a gable hood, which was worn in England during the reign of Henry VIII. Its body even kinda looks like a 16th century gown. Phalanx is based on ancient Greek soldiers, specifically the phalanx formation, which was often used in ancient Greece. Fittingly, their heads look like ancient Greek hoplite helmets, and they have round shields, just like the people in ancient Greece used. Indeedée's design is based on maids and butlers, particularly those of the Victorian and Edwwardian era, when every upper-class person had a whole host of domestic servants. The male's coloration looks like a tuxedo or a suit, and the female's looks like a black dress with a long white apron. As anyone who's seen a mystery play would know, these are what butlers and maids wore back then. Zacian and Zamazenta are inspired by medieval knights and the legend of King Arthur, so there are some clear medieval elements in their design. Zacian has its hair in braids, which was a very common hairstyle for ladies in the late Middle Ages, and Zacian is said to be Zamazenta's sister in its Shield Pokédex entry, so we know she's a lady. Zamazenta, meanwhile, has a large tuft of fur which resembles the plumes worn on helmets in the late Middle Ages. Calyrex's big bulbous head is based on the more rounded and puffy designs of royal crowns from the 14th century onwards, which were particularly popular from the 17th to the 19th centuries. In fact, considering the Crown Tundra is based on Scotland, it might be inspired by the Crown of Scotland, which is the oldest surviving crown in the British Isles and has a puffy, rounded look to it. The crown is kept in Edinburgh Castle, and is brought out on a pillow at every opening of the Scottish Parliament. And ending off this generation, I've noticed something about Enamorus. Between her white lipstick, extreme hairstyle, and skinny body with no curves, I am getting some serious mid-1960s vibes from her. How could that be, you might say? Legends Arceus is set 100 years before then. Yeah, I know, but I'm pretty sure goddesses don't have to follow the constraints of human fashion. Also, a 1960s look is especially fitting for a goddess of love. The Summer of Love took place in 1967 after all, and throughout the decade, a lot of societal expectations regarding how desire should be expressed were challenged. So, I think it makes sense. And finally, we come to the 9th generation, the most recent generation of Pokémon as of the time of me making this video. This is also the generation that introduced Paradox Pokémon, which present a bit of a challenge for me. I can't cover the future Paradox Pokémon because this is a video about history, not oracular prediction. And at first, I assumed I couldn't cover the past Paradox Pokémon because dinosaurs didn't wear clothes and we don't know exactly what cavemen wore. However, after doing some research, I learned that we do have some evidence of what people in the Stone Age would have worn, and even how they styled their hair. So the Stone Age just barely counts as an era of historical fashion. Keep that in mind going forward. Meowscarada has a late 16th century look to it. The short puffy pants over dark colored tights, the ruff around the neck, the cloak, the William Shakespeare-esque haircut, it's all there. This does make sense, as the Paldea region is based on Spain and Portugal, and the late 16th century fell within an era known as the Spanish Golden Age. In particular, Felipe II, the King of Spain during the late 16th century, was known as a great patron of Spanish culture and art. The flames on Skeledirge's head are supposed to resemble marigolds, as the Pokémon is themed around Dia de los Muertos, but they also kind of resemble a big curly hairdo, of the type that was popular in the 70s and 80s. And considering it's said to be a singer, it could have taken inspiration from any number of pop and rock stars who had similar hairstyles. Personally, I'm reminded of Art Garfunkel of Simon and Garfunkel, a folk singing duo from the 60s who were known for their calm, wistful, often sad songs. Skeledirge's singing voice is said to be gentle and soothing, and it is part of a duo as the firebird on its nose is alive. Quaxley's hairstyle is very 1950s, with its big pompadour, and this might be a pun on the ducktail, a hairstyle from the 50s that was commonly combined with the pompadour. Ducktails were slicked back and parted down the middle on the back of the head, which resembled a duck's folded wings, hence the name. It keeps the pompadour throughout its evolutionary line. Speaking of which, while Quaquaval is primarily based on the elaborate costumes worn during Carnaval, a festival celebrated in many Catholic countries including Spain and Portugal, I'm also seeing a little bit of late 70s inspiration in regards to its clothes. It's got bell bottoms, prominent shoulders, and an open shirt to show off all your jewelry and or chest hair. And, well, Quaquaval is a Pokemon that's all about dancing, and during the late 70s everybody was dancing in the disco club, so I think it makes sense. Dolliv looks 1890s to me. Its hair is put up, its collar is high, and its skirt is around the same length as dresses of that time. Perhaps it could reference the first modern Olympics in 1896, where olive leaf iconography was all over the place, due to the importance that olive trees had to ancient Greek Olympians. They used olive oil as sunscreen when playing sports and were given wreaths of olive leaves when they won. Squawkabilly, with its pompadoured hair, loud nature, and the fact that they form flocks and fight with other flocks, remind me of greasers and urban street gangs of the 50s and 60s. Ever seen West Side Story? Remember the Jets and the Sharks? Yeah, I think that's what's going on here. Like how the Sharks are all Puerto Rican, flocks of Squawkabilly primarily consist of only one color of Squawkabilly. Since the colored feathers resemble clothes, these could also be a reference to urban street gangs of the 80s and 90s, who would often wear certain colors to let other members of their gang identify them. This practice fell out of favor in the 2000s and 2010s because police and other people not involved in gang culture were catching on to it, so it was no longer a subtle tell. Plus, it was exhausting for those who lived in gang-dominated areas to avoid buying or wearing certain colors of clothing so the local gangs don't assume you're one of their enemies. Many still wear gang colors at gang meetups, though. Charcadet, Armarouge, and Cerulege all take inspiration from, once again, medieval European knight armor, particularly the armor of the late Middle Ages. Fitting, as they're based on legendary Spanish knights. Armarouge is based on a Catalonian folk hero called Guifre el Pilos, or Wilfred the Hairy, who wore golden armor and carried a golden shield. Catalonia is the part of Spain where Barcelona is, by the way. The red and yellow striped pattern on Catalonia's flag is inspired by a legend where he was visiting the court of Charles the Bald, the king of what is now France, after a fierce battle with a bleeding cut on his hand. Because he was such a brave soldier, the king decided to give him a coat of arms, and he took Wilfred's bleeding hand and dragged it across his golden shield to create 4 red lines. Hence why Armor Rouge has gold armor with red markings on it. Cerulege, by contrast, is based on El Cid, Spain's most celebrated national hero, who bravely recaptured the city of Valencia from the Arabs who were ruling much of Iberia at the time. Yeah, Spain, one of the most notorious colonial powers from the Renaissance onwards, was actually invaded and occupied by a foreign empire during the Middle Ages. Hurt people, I guess. El Cid wielded 2 swords, Tizona and Colada, and according to one story, his corpse was dressed in armor and propped up on his horse shortly after he died, inspiring his soldiers to make a thundering charge against their enemies and win the battle. This explains Cerulege's 2 sword hands and its ghost typing. While Mastiff's hair seems to just be derived from the pop cultural association of spiky blonde hair with troublemaking kids, such as Calvin from Calvin and Hobbes, Mabostiff's hair is, once again, a pompadour. The use of an old-fashioned style is likely supposed to make this Pokemon look like an older man, combined with the mustache and the fact that its hair is gray. In addition, as I mentioned with Timber, pompadours are stereotypically associated with Italians, and Mabostiff is based on the stereotypical mafia don, right down to its names in every language referencing either the mafia or the movie The Godfather, which is about the mafia. Capsakid and Scovillain both have a little bit of historical fashion inspiration in their designs. Capsakid looks like it's wearing a mob cap, an iconic hat from the 18th century, or a late 19th century bonnet. Nowadays, both of these hats are associated with babies and little girls, so it was probably done to emphasize that it's just a kid. Scovillain, meanwhile, resembles the masks worn in ancient Greek theater. Characters in tragedies would wear masks that looked like they were frowning, while characters in comedies would wear masks that looked like they were smiling. You might see these smiling and frowning masks used today as a symbol of theater in general. And before you ask if masks really count as historical clothing, if you wear it on your body, for all intents and purposes, it's clothing. The abundance of frills on Flittle and Espathra, as well as the shape of Espathra's body, remind me of the fashions of the early 1870s, though I'm fairly sure that's unintentional, and in more likelihood they're based on Sevillana dresses, which is a folk costume and therefore against my rules. However, there is a more prominent and undoubtedly intentional historical inspiration for these Pokémon. As you might guess from its name and hair, Espathra is based on Cleopatra VII, the famous queen of Egypt who ruled from 51 BC to 30 BC. She was known for her intelligence, beauty, and charisma, and managed to charm the toga off Julius Caesar, which resulted in them having an affair and a kid. Later, after Caesar's death, she entered a relationship with Marcus Antonius, who had 3 kids with her and supported her when Emperor Augustus declared war on her kingdom. Sadly, her kingdom was conquered, her boyfriend was killed, and in order to avoid being publicly executed by Augustus, she used poison to end her own life. Espathra's hair looks like the Egyptian-style royal headdresses that Cleopatra sometimes wore, as well as the hairstyle that Elizabeth Taylor wore when portraying Cleopatra in the 1963 movie Cleopatra. Bombardier has 2 main elements behind its inspiration. First, the cicogna, which means stork, an Italian bomber plane that was used in the Spanish Civil War by the nationalist side, who would go on to turn Spain into a brutal dictatorship under the rule of Francisco Franco. Hence why it's a dark type. Second, the idea of the delivery stork, but the opposite. Instead of dropping a baby into someone's chimney and starting a life, it drops a rock on someone's head and ends a life. Again, hence why it's a dark type. The latter inspiration may be why it has apron-like feathers and a topknot, as nannies for wealthy children in Victorian and Edwardian times wore long aprons and put their hair up in high buns so babies wouldn't grab it. Farigiraf looks like an astronaut wearing a space helmet, doesn't it? Well, I feel like, considering where the Paldea region is based on, that might be a reference to how the very first spacesuit was invented by a Spaniard. In 1935, Emilio Herrera Linares designed and tested a special suit that could protect from solar radiation, high and low temperatures, and extreme levels of pressure. It also came with an oxygen tank so the person inside could get air to breathe. NASA eventually picked up this technology and adapted it into the spacesuits we use today. And, I mean, if old military armor counts as historical fashion, I think old spacesuits can count too. Just as Poniard is based on Ashigaru and Bisharp is based on a samurai, King Gambit is based on a daimyo, the bosses of samurai. During the Sengoku period, each of the territories that were fighting for control of Japan was ruled by a daimyo. Well-known daimyo of the Sengoku era include Toyotomi Hideyoshi and Oda Nobunaga. Comparing King Gambit's appearance to what daimyo wore in Sengoku times, you'll see many similarities. The kimono, the kamishimo with a little red dot on each side where the family crest usually was, the obi sash, the tabi socks, the hakama-like pants, it's all there. Even its mustache is historically accurate. Most daimyo from the Sengoku era had some kind of mustache, so it must have been trendy at the time. In particular, King Gambit's coloration, long hair, and the shape of its stash are likely based on Takeda Shingen, a Sengoku-era daimyo known for his skill on the battlefield. The armor he wore in battle was primarily red and gold, and his helmet had 2 big gold horns coming from his forehead and a long wig attached to it, and his mustache curved upward in much the same way that King Gambit's blades do. Screamtail is a prehistoric version of Jigglypuff, the Pokémon that adorns my dress, and the main difference between the two of them is in their hair. Jigglypuff's hair is quite short and styled into a sort of Clark Kent curl in the front, while Screamtail's is long, messy, and brushed back. The reason why the prehistoric Screamtail has longer hair than the modern Jigglypuff may reflect how hair-cutting shears were not invented until 1500 BC in ancient Egypt, so people before then either wouldn't try to cut their hair or would use a sharpened rock and hope for a clean cut. The sharpened rock method only worked with hair that was particularly long and not in front of the face, so bangs, or any kind of hair that hung down on the forehead, weren't possible until the invention of cutting shears, hence why Screamtail's hair looks the way it does. However, the volume of its hair and the flipped ends of it do remind me of a more recent era in history, the 1960s. Screamtail even looks like it's wearing eye makeup that accentuates its lashes, which was a staple of the 1960s makeup look. I'm even wearing something similar right now! Now, why would they do this, you might ask? The 60s is nowhere near prehistoric. Well, I think it might be a reference to the movie 1 Million Years BC, which was released in 1966 and set in caveman times. While the film was nowhere near accurate to real life, it did have a massive influence on how cave people should be portrayed in film. And all the women in this movie, including Raquel Welch's character Loana, have teased up 60s hairdos much like Screamtail. And when you keep in mind that this was the same generation that gave us Pokémon based on Kamen Rider, Godzilla, and Superman, I think this Pokémon is based on a fictional character is no longer the far-fetched claim it once was. Also, for the record, I decided I was going to wear a Jigglypuff-themed 60s outfit for this video before I had formulated my Screamtail's hair as a reference to 1 million years BC hypothesis. It was simply a coincidence. Brute Bonnet is mostly just a prehistoric mushroom with dinosaur elements, but the way the mold drapes down on its head reminds me of a type of hat that is far from prehistoric, but still quite old, the Wei Mao. Invented in China sometime during the Northern Wei dynasty and becoming popular in the Tang dynasty, the Wei Mao is a wide-brimmed hat with a veil of sheer fabric, usually worn by women. Some Wei Mao had a little gap for their wearer to look out of, much like what we see on Brute Bonnet. When you consider this game was made in Japan, and Chinese civilization is much, much older than Japanese civilization and was a huge source of inspiration in Japan's early days, something Chinese being added to a prehistoric Pokémon would make sense. The magnetic filings that are stuck to sandy shocks resemble patches of black fur, and with the way it's positioned, it kinda looks like a fur hat, a fur cape, and a pair of fur boots, if you squint. Because this is a prehistoric Pokémon, this is likely referencing the fact that, according to archaeologists, the first material humans ever made clothes out of was animal hide, which is usually covered in fur. How do we know this? Well, the earliest tools we've found pertaining to the construction of clothing are actually brushes and blades that were used to clean off animal skins so humans could wear them as cloaks. Modern furriers still use tools like these to turn animal pelts into fur coats. Later, hominids would invent the sewing needle, with the earliest known sewing needle being a 50,000-year-old bone needle that was found in Russia. These sewing needles allowed us to shape furs and skins into clothes that fit more snugly on our body, including hats and shoes. Goldango is obviously based on a surfer. Its Japanese name is even Surfugo, and its hair reflects this. It's yellow, voluminous, and a bit messy, reflecting the long, curly blonde styles that were popular amongst surfer dudes in the 60s and 70s. Furthermore, the explosion of surf culture in the 1960s was primarily centered around California, and California's nickname is the Golden State, due to the large gold deposits that were found there in 1849. Golden State, Goldango, it all makes sense. And California did used to be a colony of Spain, so there's that too. The treasures of ruin are all implied to be from whatever the Pokemon world's equivalent of China is, which is probably a reference to the fact that Portugal, one of the two countries that Paldea is based on, was the first European country to reach China by sea, and traded heavily with China starting in 1513. They even set up a city in southern China called Macau, which still exists to this day. So, these 4 Pokemon all have elements of ancient Chinese fashion in their designs. First of all, Wo Qian and Ting Lu both look like they have beards. Remember what I said about how people weren't allowed to shave in ancient China because their hair was a gift from their parents? Yeah. Second, going off of the facial hair thing, Qian Pao's sword fangs kind of look like a mustache, specifically the droopy, horseshoe-shaped type that was common on many Chinese historical figures, including Sun Tzu. Third, the bowl that Ting Lu wears as a hat is similar in its shape to the hats that many men wore during China's Ming Dynasty, which were called Fu Tou. And finally, Qi Yu's eyes are made of curved jade beads, which could reference the many jade amulets and trinkets that were made in ancient China since prehistoric times. Specifically, they resemble Huang, which were jade trinkets shaped like an arc that have been used as jewelry charms since the Shang Dynasty, but were especially popular in the Zhou and Warring States eras. Sinischa is based on matcha tea and Japanese tea ceremonies, and is designed to be a more Asian counterpart to Poltergeist, who is based on black tea and British tea culture. And in my opinion, Sinistra does the idea of a tea Pokemon a little better than Poltergeist does, if only because its signature move, Matcha Gotcha, has a chance to burn the opponent. Anyone who drinks tea on a regular basis will tell you that they have burned their tongue on hot tea at least once. And to emphasize its Japanese-ness, the whisk on its head looks like a little Hime cut! Isn't that cute? Okidogi, Monkey Dory, and Pheasantipede, aka the Loyal 3 or Lousy 3, all have a little V-shaped patch on their stomachs that is the same color as their face, making them look like they're wearing kimono. So at first glance, they don't look historical, just traditionally Japanese. But Okidogi looks like it's wearing a kamishimo, popular during the Sengoku and Edo periods among the well-to-do. Monkey Dory looks like it has a chonmage, a hairstyle worn by samurai during the Edo period, and Pheasantipede's sash-like toxic chain is tied in the front, which is how obi sashes for kimono originally were tied until about the 18th century. This makes sense as they're based on the animals in the story of Momotaro, a Japanese fairy tale which was first written down in the early 17th century, during the beginning of the Edo period. Ogerpon's masks are designed after the masks used in No theater, a type of traditional Japanese theater that dates back to the 14th century. The placement of Ogerpon's horns on both her unmasked form and on her terastallized masks, and the fact that she's a she, point towards the famous Hanya mask, which is used in No to represent a female character who has figuratively and literally become a monster. It's designed to look angry when viewed from the front, but sad when viewed at an angle, conveying the idea that the character wearing the mask only turned evil because of factors outside of her control and feels shameful about her actions deep down. This fits Ogerpon when you remember what her backstory is. She was shunned by the villagers for her monstrous appearance, so she wore masks to cover her face and not scare everyone she meets. You know, like the Phantom of the Opera. She only became driven to anger and violence after the Loyal 3 stole 3 of her precious masks. On the outside, she's a terrifying monster, but on the inside, she's sad. Speaking of her precious masks, each of them is based on a different type of No mask. The teal mask is based on Okina men masks, which are designed to look like they're laughing. The Wellspring mask is based on Onna men masks, which resemble pretty women and often look sad or wistful. The Hearthflame mask is based on Oni men masks, which are used to represent Oni, the type of yokai that Ogerpon is largely based on. She even wields a club that is similar to those that Oni are thought of as using. And the Cornerstone mask is based on Butsumen masks, which were used to represent gods. You know, what most legendary Pokemon are heavily implied, if not stated, to be. And in addition to all of that, Ogerpon has some more recent inspirations as well. Her big, sparkly eyes, orange face, and short skirt are inspired by Ganguro fashion, which was popular in Japan during the 90s and 2000s. You may remember that I brought it up earlier when I was talking about Jinx. The defining feature of Ganguro fashion is a very heavy tan, which is where the style gets its name. Ganguro is Japanese for exceptionally dark. And as anyone who's lived through the 2000s will tell you, if you have pale skin and you use a lot of tanning spray or tanning lotion, your skin's gonna end up looking orange. Just like Ogreppon's skin. Makeup-wise, Ganguro girls tended to wear thick black eyeliner and white eyeshadow over and under the eyes to make them look bigger. This explains why Ogrepon has huge eyes and looks like she's wearing black eyeliner. And finally, clothes-wise, Ganguro tended to dress in summery outfits, often including short-sleeve shirts, shorts, tank tops, miniskirts, and platformer wedge sandals, explaining why Ogrepon looks like she's wearing a very short skirt and sandals, and why her feet are positioned like she's wearing heels or wedges. In conclusion, Shrek was right. This ogre's got layers to her design. And I would expect nothing less from the brainchild of Hitoshi draws robot masters better than anyone else on Earth, Ariga. And finally, we have Pecharunt, which is based on Momotaro himself, just as the Loyal Three are based on his animal friends and Ogrepon is based on the Oni he fought. As you can see, he's got some kind of ponytail, and during the Edo period, hair pulled back in a ponytail or some other kind of updo was very common for teenage boys, as they were too young to have their heads fully shaven. And most tellings of Momotaro do say that Momotaro was in his teens when he set out on his adventure. So yeah, Pecharunt is a teenager. And judging by my memories of 8th grade, yeah, he's a pretty accurate representation of one. Phew. That was a long video. Probably the longest I've ever made. If you made it to the end of this video without skipping anything, I'm impressed. Of course, there are probably some that I've missed, and probably some where I'm just reaching and seeing things the creators never intended. Either way, I hope I could help you see some of these Pokémon in a whole new way, and teach you about historical and vintage fashion using the most successful media franchise of all time. Anyways, if you liked the video, or are just impressed by my crazy eyeliner, be sure to like and subscribe, and make sure to support my Patreon if you can! Until next time, stay stylish.